Chapter 681. Sure enough, it was better to rely on oneself than on others. It was better to rely on oneself than on others, because Yi Feng and the others had been running in circles to avoid Yi Qinghuan's pursuit. The place where they were caught was not far from the Bright Reverence cult's headquarters. Yi Qinghuan rode on the Qinghuan heavenly bird, carried the dying cat, and carried Yi Feng. In less than an hour, they returned to her old territory. Of course, she did not let Ning Xuema have an easy time along the way. As long as she saw that she was slightly awake, she would torture her. Her technique was indeed powerful. She could torture Ning Xuema's soul without hurting the white cat's body. Before the discomfort of being drowned by the water disappeared, she began to taste the feeling of being blown apart by the hurricane. Every time her soul could not hold on and was about to fall apart, Yi Qinghuan would try to gather her soul back together. After stabilizing a little, she would continue to torture her. Ning Xuema finally knew that death was such a difficult thing. She finally knew that there was such a punishment in this world. Little girl, it seems that you don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. I will teach you a lesson. When Ning Xuema was half unconscious, she heard Yi Qinghuan's words. The voice was as cold and noble as usual, but the words were bloodthirsty and cruel. Ning Xuema was in a trance, but she did not lower herself and replied, "Old woman, I will wait and see." As soon as it finished speaking, it was picked up by the cold wind and continued to taste the pain of being torn apart by the hurricane. When Ning Xuema was slightly awake again, she opened her eyes and found that she was in a large hall. She slowly turned her eyes and recognized that this hall was one of Yi Qinghuan's side halls. There were not many things in the side hall, but each of them looked very strange. There was a red and black whip, a light green nail board, and even a guillotine. The most conspicuous thing was the big cauldron in the middle of the hall. There was a light green flame burning under the cauldron, and boiling oil was rolling in the cauldron. This place was like a torture chamber. The only difference between this place and the torture chambers in other places was that the torture instruments in other places were real, but the torture instruments in this place seemed to be illusory. They were all shrouded in a layer of light green, like silhouettes. Little girl, you've got guts. How dare you provoke me? I've been too nice to you. I didn't let you taste these punishments, and you're already so lawless. Yi Qinghuan lifted Ning Xuema up, looked into its eyes and smiled gently. Tell me, which one should I let you taste first? Have you heard of the 18 levels of hell? Climb a mountain of blades, dive into a pot of boiling oil, and be sliced in half with a knife. Or do you want to have a taste of the whip first? After going through a round of flooding and several rounds of heavenly winds, her head was already dizzy. She couldn't even hear Yi Qinghuan's words clearly. He could only faintly hear something about the 18 levels of hell. She stared blankly at the whip, unable to react for a moment. Did this bastard woman want to whip her? Haha, wasn't she afraid that her precious cat would be whipped to death? She smiled absent-mindedly. When she was really desperate, she would not give in. Bitch who no one wants, just bring it on. Look, I'm not afraid of you. Bastard. Yi Qinghuan's face changed. This bitch who no one wanted had provoked her. She threw Ning Xuema to the ground, opened her hand, and the red and black whip fell into her hand. She whipped Ning Xuema. Chapter 682. The red and black shadow of the whip swept across the white cat's body. There were no wounds on the white cat's body, but it rolled over with a low cry. Ning Xuema finally understood what was going on. It turned out that this damned woman's torture tools were specifically targeted at souls. What she had hit was a soul and not the white cat. Her soul was in so much pain that it almost split open. Ning Xuema trembled slightly on the ground, but she laughed loudly. Old woman, you're angry out of shame. Ha ha ha. Yi Qinghuan was speechless. Usually when she whipped the cat, even the most cunning soul would bow down and beg for mercy. She didn't expect that Ning Xuema, who she thought was the most obedient, would be so infuriating once she got tough. Let's see if you can still be so stubborn. Yi Qinghuan was so angry that she whipped the cat again and again. The white cat kept rolling on the ground. It hurt. It hurt as if it was being torn apart. Ning Xuema felt like she was going to be whipped into pieces. Her soul couldn't hold on anymore and slowly cracked open. Was she going to die completely? This vague thought flashed through her mind. Ever since she came to this world, she had been trying her best to live. No matter what happened, she never gave up on the chance to live. She wanted to live on. But now she longed to die. She longed to have her soul scattered and become unconscious. She had been relying on her unyielding spirit to support herself, but now her spirit was also collapsing. Once her vitality was released, the originally well-combined soul could no longer be held together and began to drift away piece by piece. You can't take it anymore? You want to give up? I haven't had enough fun yet. Yi Qinghuan waved her sleeve and a faint green light enveloped the white cat. The slowly escaping soul was once again forcefully gathered together. Ning Xuema felt like her body was being forcefully twisted and then curled up. Her hands and feet were no longer in their original positions, and all the joints were dislocated. Where the hands should be, there were legs installed, and where the neck should be, there was a head forcibly installed. It was an indescribable feeling of terror and pain. In the end, she was still a girl. She had never suffered such pain in her life. In her daze, she instinctively screamed. Since she was in the cat's body, her voice was naturally a mournful cat's meow. Her voice was so pitiful that it was frightening to hear. Yi Qinghuan finally smiled with satisfaction. She picked her up and walked to the big cauldron. You will look better if you are fried in the oil. Don't worry, the oil inside is from the underworld. It will only fry your soul. It won't hurt my precious cat. Throwing a soul into a pot of boiling oil was the worst punishment for a soul. She believed that after this audacious little girl was fried in a pot of oil, her soul would fly away and be annihilated. He had chased her for half a day and was exhausted. He had to ask his disciples to find a fresh soul to replace Ning Xuema and live in the cat's body. Then she could go and rest after dealing with Ning Xuema. Her painstaking collection over the years flashed in front of her eyes. She clenched her fists with hatred. She was about to throw Ning Xuema into the oil cauldron when the door was pushed open with a bang. A disciple rushed in and said, Master Dizun. Dizun is here. What? Yi Qinghuan's heart felt like it was hit by a big hammer. The white cat in her hand fell to the ground. Her master was here. Her master was here. How could it be? Chapter 683. All these years, Yi Qinghuan had been scheming to see Dizun again, but she couldn't. He had always avoided her. He also didn't allow her to approach the Sun Moon sect. Now he was here. Did he finally remember her? Yi Qinghuan's hands and feet trembled, and her mind went blank. She subconsciously said, Quick, invite him. No, order all the disciples to go out and welcome him. She subconsciously pulled her clothes, tidied her hair, and was about to run out. Bang! With a loud sound, the half-closed door suddenly broke into pieces and flew out. Yi Qinghuan was so shocked that she trembled. She hurriedly raised her head, and then stood there as if struck by lightning. A figure in white appeared at the door of the hall. His white robe was like winding clouds, and his hair was like the purest ink. The mask on his face covered his entire face, and only a pair of ink-black eyes were like cold whirlpools. After not seeing him for so many years, he still looked the same as before. It was the face she yearned for day and night. Master. Yi Qinghuan didn't expect to see him again. She staggered 2 steps forward and crawled at his feet just like before. She thought that Dizun would wave his sleeves and ask her to stand up after she finished the greeting as a disciple, just like before. She didn't expect that he would wave his sleeves, but he didn't ask her to stand up. Yi Qinghuan hadn't even touched the corner of Dizun's clothes when her body suddenly swayed and was thrown out like a broken bag. With a bang, she hit the pillar. Yi Qinghuan was hit so hard that she saw stars flying in front of her eyes. Her heart was so shocked that it almost split open. Master! She called out in a trembling voice. Her hair was messed up and her clothes were messy. She got up dizzily and couldn't help but look at Dizun. Then she was stunned. Dizun actually picked up the cat. His fingers gently stroked the cat's head, and his fingertips trembled slightly. He was too late. Ning Xuema had already been tortured, and her soul was trembling violently in the cat's body. He picked her up, but she didn't seem to feel anything. Master, do you still remember Xiaobai? It's the cat that Master asked Disciple to adopt back then. Disciple has always kept it alive and well, just so that Master can see it again one day. Yi Qinghuan knelt down at the side again, her lips trembling with excitement. Shut up. The ancestor finally opened his mouth. His voice was as cold as the wind of the 12th lunar month. His gaze finally fell on her. Yi Qinghuan, I am no longer your master. Yi Qinghuan's body trembled. Her lips squirmed, but she did not dare to say anything else. Master! Kiran rushed into the hall and ran straight to the ancestor's feet. He looked at the white cat in the ancestor's arms. Master! Master! Yi Qinghuan's eyes widened. Qilin beast! This Kiran must be summoning that bitch. On this continent, there was only one person who had subdued a Qilin beast, that trash Ning Xuema. She was well informed. In fact, she had long heard of Ning Xuema's reputation, but she didn't take this little girl seriously. After hearing about Ning Xuema, she was not interested in this person. Instead, she was very interested in Kiran, who was by her side. However, she had not found the time to visit her yet. Who would have thought? The soul that she had accidentally captured was actually that useless girl. That ancestor. Ancestor came for her? No, it couldn't be, right? How could that bitch be favored by Ancestor? Or maybe Ancestor also took a fancy to the Qilin beast, so he paid a little attention to that girl? In that instant, many questions flashed through her mind. Chapter 684. Yi Qinghuan's greedy eyes fell on the Dizun again. She wanted to devour every inch of him. She missed him deeply. When she saw him again, she wanted to engrave his figure in her heart. She saw Kiran desperately pulling at the Dizun's robe with its 2 claws and couldn't help but be furious. The Dizun wouldn't allow anyone or any beast to approach and violate him. This little Qilin actually dared to scratch an emperor without knowing the immensity of heaven and earth. How dare you, Kiran beast! Yi Qinghuan shouted angrily. She was about to cast a spell to push Kiran away. But when she saw the Dizun's next move, she stopped. The Dizun's fingers gently wrapped around the cat's head, and a faint white light completely enveloped it. The spell that Yi Qinghuan cast on the white cat was easily dissolved by him, and Ning Xuema's soul was taken out by him. Ning Xuema's soul had been twisted into a ball and was trembling in his palm. She was in a semi-conscious state and didn't know that she had fallen into the Dizun's hands. The only thing she felt now was pain. It was so painful that she wanted to disperse and turn into ashes. That was because she had wanted to give up, and she had suffered so much. Her soul was already severely injured, and the moment she mentioned it, her 3 souls and 6 spirits showed signs of dissipating. Xuema! The Dizun's voice was tight. He waved his fingers and waves of green light completely enveloped her soul. He nourished her with his psychic power. Xuema, don't give up. Master! Kiran usually couldn't see Ning Xuema's soul. It could only see it when it turned on its tearful mode. Kiran didn't cry easily, but it had just experienced almost the same pain as Ning Xuema. It was in so much pain that it had tears in its eyes. So it could see Ning Xuema's soul clearly now. At this moment, when it saw that she was almost deformed, it cried out, Master! Master! Yi Qinghuan looked at this scene blankly, and her heart sank. She had never seen the Dizun treat someone so gently. Her whole body was cold, and her eyes flashed with hatred as she looked at Ning Xuema's soul. Jealousy burned like a raging fire in her chest. If she had known earlier, she would have destroyed this living soul the moment she caught it. Her master was hers. There should only be one woman by her master's side. The ancestor was standing right there. She was so close to him, but she didn't dare to take a step forward. She didn't dare to touch the corner of his clothes. No matter how hard she tried, she still couldn't get close to the ancestor. However, the soul of Ning Xuema, an ordinary person, was placed in the palm of his hand and protected. She hated Ning Xuema so much that she clenched her teeth, but she didn't dare to show it on her face. She said in a low voice, Disciple. Disciple didn't know that Master cared about her. Before she could finish her explanation, a long black and red shadow flashed past her eyes. With a smack, it brushed past her mouth. Ah! Yi Qinghuan was caught off guard. She screamed and fell to the ground. I'll say it again, I'm not your master. Yi Qinghuan, how many times have you whipped her? The ancestor's voice was like a storm. His hand was holding the punishment whip that specialized in beating souls. Yi Qinghuan didn't know how many people she had whipped with this whip, but she never thought that one day this whip would fall on her body. The ancestor's lightning whip almost split her soul in half. She was in so much pain that she rolled on the ground, unable to say a word. The ancestor's eyes fell on Ning Xuema's soul. There were several whip marks on it, and each of them hurt her soul root. Chapter 685. The ancestor coldly said, "Yi Qinghuan, since you whipped her 10 times, I will make you pay back double." Seeing Ning Xuema's soul seriously injured, he was furious to the extreme. After he finished speaking, he waved his hand. That black and red whip immediately flew up by itself and lashed towards Yi Qinghuan, who was on the ground. The whip's shadow moved horizontally and vertically, tearing the air with a whistling sound. Yi Qinghuan was scared out of her wits. She wanted to dodge but didn't dare to. Moreover, with her strength she couldn't dodge. The whip's shadow fell on her body like a viper. The whip fell, accompanied by a scream, and she rolled on the ground. When she used this whip to whip others, she was afraid that it wasn't painful enough, that it wasn't ruthless enough. Now that the whip had landed on her body, she realized that it was actually this painful. Every whip almost pierced into her bone marrow and spread from the depths of her bone marrow to her limbs and bones. She had originally wanted to be strong in front of the Dizun, so she didn't struggle or shout. But when the whip landed on her body, the pain spread throughout her body like lightning, and she couldn't help but scream. She couldn't help but tremble and roll. Her scream was so shrill that it almost penetrated the roof tiles. In fact, many Bright Reverence Religion disciples had gathered outside the main hall. After all, the arrival of the ancestor was no different from spring thunder to the disciples of Bright Reverence Religion. Everyone's spirit was lifted. After all the disciples here knew that their leader was once the ancestor's disciple. The disciples of Bright Reverence Religion basically relied on this name to travel outside. A large part of the reason why many people joined Bright Reverence Religion was because of this relationship. The Sun Moon sect's disciple selection was very strict. With their aptitude they couldn't enter. Therefore they chose to join Bright Reverence Religion. This made them feel as if they were also disciples of the Sun Moon sect, just a side branch. Because of this relationship, the number of disciples joining Bright Reverence Religion was more than other sections. This was also the reason why Bright Reverence Religion was able to grow so strong over the years. These disciples naturally longed for the ancestor and revered him as if he was a god. However, after joining Bright Reverence Religion for so many years, they hadn't seen the ancestor even once. Now they heard that the ancestor had personally come. This news spread like lightning in Bright Reverence Religion. Many disciples heard the news and came. They all gathered outside the main hall, waiting for the ancestor to come out and greet him. Naturally, after they arrived, they heard some disciples whispering that the venerable ancestor didn't seem to have good intentions. He suddenly appeared. After he arrived, he didn't even wait for the disciples' report and directly barged into the mountain gate to look for Yi Qinghuan. The Bright Reverence cult's disciples were curious and bewildered, but there was also fear and excitement as they waited outside. He didn't have the guts to go in and take a look, but he couldn't bear to leave. Not long after the venerable sovereign went in, Yi Qinghuan's blood-curdling screams could be heard from the main hall. The disciples present were all frightened and looked at each other in dismay. It seemed like the ancestor wasn't as tolerant and affectionate towards their cult master as the cult master had boasted. This was especially true for some of the female disciples. When they heard their master's screams in the main hall, they were frightened and felt as if their idol had collapsed. Girls were romantic. Before they entered Bright Reverence Religion, they had vaguely heard about the matter between Yi Qinghuan and the ancestor. Yi Qinghuan was very good at dealing with people. She also knew how to make people misunderstand her without being exposed. She was very secretive about the matter between her and her master. However, she would intentionally or unintentionally reveal some things that the ancestor had given her. She would also say some specious words. Chapter 686. Because of this, almost everyone believed that the ancestor had feelings for Yi Qinghuan and had no choice but to expel her from the sect. But because of her, he no longer accepted female disciples. This kind of story was always easy to move the hearts of girls. Looking at their master, they also felt bitter and noble. After all, they had never heard of a woman who could move the ancestor's heart. However, their master was the only one who could do so. Therefore, they always believed that the ancestor secretly liked Yi Qinghuan and treated her very differently. Even if she was expelled from the sect, he would still dote on her. The ancestor would always cover the bright reverence religion. No matter what the disciples of the bright reverence religion did outside, the ancestor would turn a blind eye and not care. When necessary, the ancestor would even defend them without any principles. Yi Qinghuan was able to obtain the ancestor's appreciation and was accepted as a disciple. Her talent was naturally outstanding. If she did not have any other thoughts and continued to cultivate under the ancestor, perhaps she would have become a real master. Unfortunately, Yi Qinghuan fell in love too early and had a stubborn temperament. After only 3 years of learning under the ancestor, she was ruthlessly expelled by him. How many things could she learn in 3 years? In addition, ever since Yi Qinghuan was expelled from the sect, there had been a knot in her heart, so her cultivation progress was not fast. After cultivating for 100 years, she was only around the 6th level of the Earth stage. Among the ancestors of the various sects on this continent, she was really not outstanding. The reason why her bright reverence religion could develop to this extent was because she had the gimmick of being the ancestor's only female disciple. Everyone thought that the ancestor treated Yi Qinghuan differently, but they did not expect that after not appearing here for hundreds of years, he would be so fierce. Listening to her master's tragic cry, it did not seem like the ancestor was reminiscing about the past with her. The disciples of the bright reverence religion were slightly different from the disciples of other sections. These people did not join the sect simply to cultivate superb techniques. Most of them wanted to have a protective umbrella and a flashy identity. With such a purpose, they naturally did not practice as hard as the disciples of other sections. Moreover, the quality of their thoughts was also very mixed. There were very few real talents. In addition, the martial arts taught by Yi Qinghuan were not the best. Therefore, although the bright reverence cult was very famous these years, the real masters were very rare, and most of them had low moral standing. Besides, although Yi Qinghuan's reputation outside was that she was protective of her disciples, she herself was not generous to her disciples. She was even a little harsh. Her disciples also criticized her a lot, but they did not dare to show it. Now that she was screaming miserably in the main hall, the disciples looked at each other in dismay. Not to mention rushing in to save people, no one even rushed in to take a look. Hearing Yi Qinghuan's tragic cry, they quietly took a few steps back. Some of the intelligent monsters had already begun to ponder over the idea of leaving bright reverence religion. Naturally, the people in the hall would not know about the undercurrent outside. The 20 lashes were quickly finished. Even with Yi Qinghuan's cultivation, half of her life was gone. She lay on the ground, twitching non-stop. The whip didn't hit her body, so other than rolling around messily, there wasn't a single wound on her body. However, there were spirit medicines that could heal physical injuries, and they would recover quickly. This soul was injured, but it could not be healed. She would not be able to recover from this whipping even after a few decades. Chapter 687. Yi Qinghuan's voice had already become hoarse from all the shouting. At this moment she was lying on the ground, gasping for breath. The hall was so quiet that only the sound of her heavy breathing could be heard. As for the ancestor, after he finished the 20 lashes, he casually threw the whip away. It fell in front of Yi Qinghuan, causing her to tremble in fear. She could feel that the ancestor was coldly looking at her. His body was filled with murderous intent. That powerful murderous intent made Kiran, who was beside him, shudder. She did not dare to cry again. Yi Qinghuan naturally also felt that kind of aura. She had stayed by his side for 3 years, but she had never seen him so angry. This made her inexplicably think of a rumor. The ancestor was not easily angry. Once he was angry, he would be like thunder. It was possible that blood would flow like a river. She panicked. Ancestor, ancestor. Blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. She did not dare to call him master again. Ignoring the tearing pain all over her body, her eyes widened. Trembling, she reached out her hand to the ancestor. This disciple did not do it on purpose. This disciple did not know her identity. She destroyed this disciple's things and killed 17 bright reverence disciples. This disciple punished her. Ancestor, this disciple knows her mistake. Her voice was mournful as she lay on the ground. Ancestor, Qinghuan was once your disciple. The ancestor faintly frowned and quietly took a step back. Because this disciple had feelings for him, She was unceremoniously expelled from the sect. But after all, he had personally taught her martial arts for several years. If he said that he did not have any feelings for her, it would be a lie. He still had a little bit of master-disciple relationship with her. The moment he saw that Ning Xuema was seriously injured, his first thought was to kill the culprit, Yi Qingwan, and scatter her soul. But now, seeing her like this, you ignored Xuema's wishes and turned her into a cat. Now you blame her for destroying your things? The ancestor coldly said. He glanced at the cat's body on the ground and frowned in disgust. With his cultivation, he could naturally see that this cat was a rather ordinary domestic cat. Moreover, it had a kind of evil aura. This cat should have died long ago. It was just that someone had used the soul energy of a living soul to support this cat's body so that it wouldn't rot or break. In fact, Dizun had long heard that Yi Qingwan loved a cat very much. He thought that she was raising a little cat demon and didn't care about her, so he didn't pay attention to this cat at all. It was only because he had just pulled Ning Xuema's soul out of the cat's body that he paid extra attention to it. Seeming to have noticed the ancestor's gaze, Yi Qingwan crawled over with difficulty and held the cat in her arms. She looked at the ancestor with fanaticism and expectation in her eyes. Mas. Ancestor, do you still remember this cat? It was rescued by the venerable sovereign in the dark forest when he brought his disciples out for training. Master. Venerable sovereign, you even teased it. The ancestor faintly frowned. In order to train his disciples, he would usually take them to the dark forest to gain experience. Firstly, he wanted to see their aptitude, and secondly, he wanted to see their courage. His memory could be considered extremely strong, and he vaguely remembered that there was indeed such a thing. At that time, he threw Yi Qingwan into the dark forest and stayed there for 3 days. 3 days later, he went to see her and found that there was an extra cat by her side. It seemed to be this white cat. There were many demonic beasts in the dark forest, but it was rare to see a pure domestic cat like this white cat. This domestic cat probably accompanied Yi Qingwan for 3 days, and she liked it very much. She whispered to the ancestor to let her take this cat in. Chapter 688. At that time, although the ancestor felt that his disciple raising a cat was a little too frivolous, considering that she was a girl and the cat was indeed well behaved, he agreed. He also threw the wild rabbit leg that Yi Qingwan gave him as a filial piety to the cat. Of course, the ancestor didn't take this little episode to heart. If it weren't for his super powerful memory, even if Yi Qingwan mentioned it, he might not have remembered it. It was just an ordinary and good-looking house cat. The lifespan of a cat was only about 10 years. How did she make it live for hundreds of years? He remembered the spirit trapping technique that was used on the cat. It seemed that Ning Xuema wasn't the first victim. There should be other living souls for her to use. This spirit trapping technique was a forbidden technique. Although he also knew it, he had never used it nor taught it to his disciple. Where did Yi Qingwan learn it? How many innocent creatures had she harmed? The ancestor thought of the rumors about Yi Qingwan in Jianghu. His eyes darkened and he casually swept his gaze around the hall. His gaze fell on the big cauldron. The boiling oil in the cauldron was still boiling, bringing with it a burning heat. Soul refining cauldron. It was a magic tool used to refine souls. Only the prison wardens of the underworld could have it. It was used to deal with those evil spirits who had done all kinds of evil in their lives. His gaze fell on the sharp dingban and the bright guillotine, and his pupils constricted slightly. These two things were also owned by the prison wardens of the 18th layer of hell. The nail was used to nail people's souls. Each nail was enough to nail a restrained soul. As for the guillotine, it would let the tortured soul taste the torture of being cut in half at the waist from time to time. The pain would tear the soul apart and slowly disperse the soul. Each of the things here was used to refine souls. They should be used to deal with those evil spirits who had committed heinous crimes, didn't repent, and couldn't be redeemed even if they died 100 times. Even the king of hell would be frightened if he saw these things. But now they had appeared here so openly. They appeared in the main hall of the Bright Reverence School, which considered itself an orthodox school. Each of these things was a rare magic tool. It was impossible to collect them in a short time. Furthermore, Yi Qingwan didn't send them here just to deal with Ning Xuema. They had been here for a long time. Yi Qinghuan was his former female disciple, a disciple who practiced orthodox Taoist techniques, a disciple who once said in front of him that it was her duty to rid the world of evil and bring peace to the people. But now, such an evil thing had appeared in her palace. Di Zun's eyes finally fell on Yi Qinghuan again. His eyes were cold without any warmth, as if it was the first time he had seen her. Yi Qinghuan's heart tightened under his gaze and her body shrank back. At the same time, her mind, which had been in chaos since the appearance of the venerable sovereign, finally cleared up. Her gaze swept over the magic tools in her hall, and her face instantly turned pale. She struggled on the ground and subconsciously wanted to put away those things, but how could she do it? Yi Qinghuan, I was wrong about you in the end. The ancestor spoke slowly, a cold glint flashing in his extremely black eyes. He thought that because she had some thoughts that she shouldn't have, her temper was a bit stubborn and her actions were a bit paranoid. Yi Qinghuan didn't like to explain, so it was inevitable that people would misunderstand her. There were also many people who criticized her secretly. Her actions shouldn't be too excessive, but he didn't expect. Chapter 689. It turned out that Yi Qinghuan was already so extreme. What was the difference between her and the witch? If she was really the witch of the devil world, it would be fine, but she was also wearing the cloak of an orthodox sect. Wherever she went, she liked to use the ancestor's banner. He was partial to his disciple, but it didn't mean that he had no bottom line. The cold aura on his body was too strong, and his powerful pressure filled the entire hall, making everything in the hall seem like it was going to be covered with a layer of frost. Kiran saw him like this for the first time. He was so scared that he quietly stepped back and shook the scales on his body. As a bystander, Kiran was already like this, let alone Yi Qinghuan, who was facing his pressure. Master! Yi Qinghuan's heart almost jumped out, and she called out to him in a panic. Just as she called out, a gust of cold wind flashed past her lips, and her face seemed to be whipped. She screamed and several of her teeth were whipped out. I don't have a disciple like you, the ancestor said coldly, and there was no warmth in his voice. Yi Qinghuan, you are so insidious. How can you be worthy of the martial arts I taught you? He stretched out his left hand, and a snow-white long sword appeared in his palm. This long sword seemed to be made of ice and snow, and the cold edge of the sword revealed a dense chill. As soon as Yi Qinghuan saw the sword, she knew that something bad had happened. She was almost scared out of her wits. Mas. Ancestor, disciple. No, this lowly one won't dare to do it again. Ancestor, please don't. She didn't even have time to beg for mercy when a snow-white light flashed in front of her eyes and fell on several of her vital acupoints. Yi Qinghuan's body suddenly became cold, as if her whole body was poured by ice and snow. All of her veins were frozen inch by inch, and when the ice and snow melted, the psychokinesis flowing in her veins quietly disappeared. Her face was pale, and she was lying on the ground, unable to get up. Despair engulfed her. Her martial arts were completely destroyed. From now on she was a complete waste. She couldn't cultivate anymore. Yi Qinghuan, from today onwards, this lord will order people to thoroughly investigate your and Bright Reverence cult's actions in these past years. You must give an explanation to the people of the world. The ancestor spat out these words. Then he walked out of the hall without looking back. Yi Qinghuan's face became even paler. When the ancestor wanted to thoroughly investigate something, there was nothing he couldn't find out. Then all the dirty things she had done all these years, with the venerable emperor's thunderous methods of handling matters, she was afraid that it would not be as simple as having her martial arts crippled. She desperately threw herself forward and looked at the ancestor's back as she wailed, Ancestor, for the sake of our friendship from 2,000 years ago, isn't it a bit too heartless for you to treat me like this? The ancestor's silhouette paused for a moment before he strode away. Yi Qinghuan slumped down at the entrance of the hall. The pain in her body penetrated her bones, and her heart was as cold as ice. She lay on the ground and was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he raised his head and laughed wildly. Her laughter was maniacal and shrill, completely different from her usual image. She laughed heartily and tears came out of her eyes. Ruthless. The ancestor's heart was truly ruthless. Everything that she had worked so hard for had been destroyed overnight. She had been wailing in the main hall for so long, and the ancestor had already left, but not a single disciple had come in to see her. Needless to say, her disciples either didn't react in time or realize that the myth had been broken, so they probably thought of another way out. Chapter 690. Once today's matter spread across the continent, those who had been bullied by Bright Reverence and had been afraid to speak up would soon come knocking on their door, seeking revenge for their grievances and revenge for their enmity. It wouldn't be long before Bright Reverence's disciples would become street rats, hated by everyone. Her Bright Reverence would no longer have a foothold on this continent. And the culprit behind all this was that woman, Ning Xuema. Ning Xuema. If this woman hadn't come here, how could all of this have happened? This woman had destroyed her. She had also destroyed Bright Reverence. This enmity was absolutely irreconcilable. Ning Xuema, who knows if today's me will be the same as you in the future? I want to live. I want to see you end up like me in the future. The artifacts in the main hall had been destroyed by the ancestor with a wave of his hand, leaving only Yi Qinghuan in the empty main hall, her mournful laughter spreading far and wide. Kiran was trembling with fear as it followed the ancestor. It had faintly sensed that something was wrong, but it didn't dare to say anything. When the ancestor came out, the surrounding Bright Reverence's disciples had already run away, while those who didn't run were kneeling on both sides of the road, lowering their bodies and not daring to raise their heads. The ancestor didn't even have the interest to look at them as he strode past them. However, the powerful aura he exuded caused the disciples to be tongue-tied. They didn't even dare to breathe loudly. Kiran also didn't have the heart to look at them. These people were the accomplices who had hunted down its master. Although they were just following orders to help its leader, it didn't like them. It followed the ancestor and was too lazy to pay attention to those people. A pair of teary eyes stared at the inside of the green barrier. Its master's soul was still in a strange state of distortion, trapped in a faint green light by the ancestor, like a green bubble hanging by his hand. Her soul had been tortured by Yi Qinghuan and then crudely pieced together again. In order to completely restore her soul, in addition to the ancestor's spiritual power, it also needed some special artifacts. And these artifacts could only be found in the Sun Moon sect. It was time for him to go back. Inside the green light, Ning Xuema was in so much pain that she wanted to die. She was still in a daze, and the only thing she could feel was pain. It was so painful that she wanted to disappear immediately. However, the green light enveloped her, preventing her soul from dispersing in all directions. The intense pain made her extremely anxious, and she kept darting left and right within the green light. Her irritation would only worsen the injuries to her soul. Xuema, be quiet. Be good and be quiet. The ancestor added more psyche power into the green barrier. His tone was somewhat gloomy. In his eyes, this little girl had always been tenacious and unyielding. No matter what kind of danger she encountered, she would always seek every opportunity to survive. She was weak and could even be considered a piece of trash, but her life was more exciting and resplendent than anyone else. This was the first time he had seen her like this. She wanted to die so badly. For the first time in his life, he felt a strong sense of regret. If he had not wasted those 4 hours, she would not have ended up like this. During those 4 hours, she must have been looking forward to his arrival like she was looking forward to the moon and the stars, right? And he had let her down in the end. He didn't know if Ning Xuema would have resented him the moment she was captured. After all, she was very smart. She could have calculated the time when the reinforcements would arrive based on the time when Kiran contacted her, and his usual walking speed. Chapter 691. It was less than 1,000 miles. With Han Shanyue's usual speed, it would only take him a little more than 2 hours. Adding the time spent searching, it would not exceed 4 hours. If he had arrived in time, she would not have fallen into Yi Qinghuan's hands and would not have suffered so much. Xuema, I'm sorry. His fingers gently touched the ball of green light, and his heart tightened. Inside the green light, Ning Xuema was like a bird startled by the twang of a bow. Just as his finger touched it, the soul trembled slightly and shrunk back into a corner. She seemed to be afraid of him, or it could be said that her soul was now afraid of any kind of touch. Although Ning Xuema's soul was moving, her mind was not clear. She could only rely on her instincts to cry out in pain and avoid any possible harm. No matter if the touch was to harm her or to save her, she would avoid it, and shrink there like a ball. Judging from her appearance, she shouldn't have just been injured by the whip, her soul was distorted, which was the main reason why she was in so much pain and lost consciousness. But he could not forcibly change her soul at this time. She was now like a porcelain with cracks all over her body. If he moved a little more, she might immediately break into countless pieces and never be able to be assembled again. The ancestor could not do anything to her now. At most, he could use the green light to nourish her soul and make it slightly stronger. A soul that wanted to persevere needed the support of a strong spiritual power and the belief to live. But now Ningshuama did not know whether it was because the pain was too severe or because she was in real despair. She did not have the slightest thought of living, and only hoped for death. Shuama, bear with it. I will heal you. I will not let you suffer anymore. Regardless of whether she could hear him or not, he transmitted his voice to her. Shuama, it's okay, it's okay. You are not in danger. No one will hurt you again. The ancestor transmitted his voice to comfort her again and again. Perhaps his voice transmission really worked, as the trembling soul in the green barrier finally calmed down. Dizun took the opportunity to send some telekinesis into the barrier to strengthen her soul power. Slowly, she seemed to sense something, and her mind became slightly clearer. She floated closer to him, and the ancestor heard her hoarse whisper, Han Shanyue? The prolonged pain had caused her voice to change pitch. It was trembling slightly, like a small beast that was on the verge of death. It's me. The ancestor softly spat out these two words, his eyes twinkling slightly as he looked at her. You're late. Her voice sounded as if she had been wronged. She vaguely remembered those 2 hours of fervent hope. From hope to despair, I'm sorry. In the future I won't. The ancestor could only say this, his voice filled with regret. In the future I will rely on myself. Her mind was half awake and half confused, and her mind was in a mess. She subconsciously said what she thought, I can't rely on anyone. In the future I will rely on myself. This was the only thought that came to her mind when she was captured. It was a very simple sentence, but the ancestor's heart felt as if it had been stabbed by a knife. He could not say anything. Perhaps because her thoughts were too intense, a few more cracks appeared on her soul, and the pain came again. She trembled and curled into a ball. Let me die. Han Shanyue, you are a bad person. Chapter 692. I beg you, let me die. It hurts. Just kill me. She wanted to roll around in the green light again. Ningshuama, you have to hold on. Seeing that Shuama's soul was about to dissipate, the ancestor shouted, I won't let you die. You have to hold on. But it hurts. It hurts. She was crying. At this time she had removed all her disguises and was like an ordinary girl who cried when she was in great pain. Her cries weren't loud, but it made his heart clench. Before meeting Ningshuama, he had never felt this way. This feeling was very novel to the ancestor, and it made him feel quite helpless. He could only comfort her again and again. Be good, don't cry. I will cure you. Don't cry. He had never coaxed anyone in his life. After transmitting his voice, he was also shocked by his own gentle tone. But when he heard her crying, he couldn't help but comfort her. His voice also lowered a few pitches. Kiran naturally couldn't hear their transmission, but it could hear Ningshuama crying. It was the first time it had heard its master cry like this. She was crying like a child. It also couldn't help but want to cry. It had established a blood contract with Ningshuama. But this blood contract was different from the heart-linking venomous insects. The little Qilin would only be able to empathize with her when she was in the middle of receiving an injury, or when it was an injury to her soul. Of course, this kind of feeling was not one-to-one. If Ningshuama's pain level was 10, Kiran's pain level was about 6. Once the damage to her soul was removed, no matter how much pain Ningshuama was in, Kiran wouldn't feel it. Of course, if her soul really dissipated, Kiran would also die. At this time, Kiran heard Ningshuama murmuring that she was going to die. It felt sad and tears flowed out. She immediately used telepathy to send a message. Master, I'm Little Apple. You can hear me, right? You can't die. Little Apple won't let you die. What will happen to Little Apple if you die? The more it thought about it, the sadder it became, and its tears flowed even harder. The little Qilin was crying behind them like a tearful Qilin. It was a water beast to begin with. When it cried, its tears flowed freely, forming a small stream on its face. It was a standard tearful scene. Occasionally, the ancestor would lower his head to look at it. When he saw it crying like this, the blue veins on his forehead throbbed. He had raised many mythological beasts before, but Kirin was definitely the only mythological beast that was so sentimental. If the other mythological beasts behind him were like this, he would have kicked them out of the Milky Way galaxy. This little Qilin was Ning Xuema's, and their relationship wasn't just a little good. If he sent the little Qilin flying with a kick, he reckoned that once Ning Xuemo recovered, she wouldn't let him off. He resisted the urge to kick it and shouted in a low voice, "Don't cry." Ning Xuema's crying in the green enchantment had already upset him, and he didn't know how to comfort it. Now, with the addition of the tearing Kirin, the ancestor, who had always been omnipotent, had a headache. "I'm communicating with Master. I don't want her to die. Woo, Kirin will be very sad if she dies." "Stupid. If she dies, you won't live either. What's there to be sad about?" Kirin seemed to have just remembered the blood contract. Chapter 693. Kirin's tears immediately flowed like a river again. "Master, you can't die, If you die, Little Apple won't be able to live. Little Apple hasn't lived long enough. I haven't become strong. I haven't returned home in glory. Little Apple doesn't want to die." The ancestor felt a headache coming on. "Shut up." He couldn't bear it anymore and shouted. Kirin still had resentment in her heart. Now that she was shouted at by the ancestor, she forgot to be afraid of him. "It's all your fault. You could have arrived earlier. You could have prevented her from suffering. If you hadn't gone to that tea house to drink that nuisance tea, she would have been alive and kicking right now. She wouldn't have ended up like this. This little bastard was really rebellious. She actually dared to talk to him like this." The ancestor was already anxious. Now that he was blocked by Kirin's words, anger surged in his heart. His voice suddenly became cold. "I don't have any obligation to save her. It's already good enough that I helped her." As soon as he finished speaking, he seemed to have noticed something. He turned his head and looked inside the green barrier held by his fingertips. Ning Xuema's soul had stopped crying at some point. At this moment, she was curled up in a corner of the barrier, her body trembling slightly. Her soul was originally pieced together in a mess by Yi Qingluan. Now, even her face couldn't be seen. Therefore, the ancestor couldn't see her expression clearly. "Ning Xuem." He called her tentatively. Ning Xuema curled up in the barrier and didn't respond. It seemed that her consciousness hadn't recovered yet. "Ning Xuema, can you sense me?" The ancestor's finger gently stroked the green ball. Ning Xuema still didn't have much reaction. She curled up even more. After a while she said, "It hurts." Thank God, although she was still in pain, she finally stopped crying. The ancestor couldn't do anything about her current pain. He could only wait until he got back. He was about to fly up, but Ning Xuema spat out two words that stopped him in his tracks. "Yi Feng." How could she think of another man at this moment of dizziness? Dizun's face didn't look good. Kirin, who was at his feet, jumped up. "Oh yeah, Yi Feng." At that time, Master said that Yi Feng had helped her escape. She even said that she wanted you to help Yi Feng recover his cultivation. The ancestor lowered his eyes slightly. He didn't like to meddle in other people's business. But since Ning Xuema wanted to meddle in this matter for her sake, he should save the Sharkmen. Otherwise, she would be even more dissatisfied with him when she woke up. With Bright Reverence Cult's current situation, it was very easy for the ancestor to save Yi Feng. He just casually asked a Bright Reverence Cult disciple, and that disciple immediately took him to the reincarnation pool. He fished out Yi Feng, who was on the verge of death. Because Yi Qingluan was in a hurry to deal with Ning Xuema, she didn't have time to torment him. Yi Feng didn't have many wounds on his body. He was just exhausted. The ancestor glanced at Yi Feng and knew that his wounds couldn't be immediately healed. Helpless, he could only take Yi Feng with him. On the way back, he contacted Rongyi Yuishenlin and ordered him to send Ning Xuema's body to Buddha Lotus Mountain Sun Moon Sect. On Carefree Island, Rongyi Yuishinlin didn't dare to leave the main hall where he was treating Ning Shuama. Ning Shuama's soul had already been lost to him. If anything happened to her body, the ancestor would probably tear him apart. Yunqi also sat beside him to accompany him. Chapter 694. Rongyi Yuishinlin originally wanted Yunqi to leave first, but she refused. She felt that she was responsible for the loss of Ning Shuama's soul. If she hadn't suffered from qi deviation and needed treatment, Rongyi Yuishinlin wouldn't have left. She wasn't prepared to leave before she received definite news about Ning Shuama. Rongyi Yuishinlin glanced at her and didn't say anything else. He tacitly allowed her to stay. During this time, Rongyi Yuishinlin didn't leave the main hall. Yunqi was afraid that he would be bored and suggested a few games of chess, but he rejected her. Guarding the mud shell that contained Ning Shuama's body was even more important than Grand Supreme Elderly Lord refining pills. At this time, Rongyi Yuishinlin received news from the Dizun and immediately started to make preparations. At this time, Ning Shuama's body had almost fully recovered. He carefully broke the mud shell and revealed the person inside. This time there weren't any problems with the recovery. Rongyi Yuishinlin used his telekinesis to check her aura. It was as good as expected. That pair of small feet should have recovered as well. He heaved a sigh of relief. Finally, there weren't any accidents with this body. He told the Dizun this good news, but the Dizun only replied, "Use your telekinesis to protect her. Send her over." Rongyi Yuishinlin was still worried about Ning Shuama's soul. "Dizwa, how is her soul?" The voice on the other side deepened slightly, but he replied casually, "It's all right. Bring the purple cloud fruit over." The purple cloud fruit was specially used to recuperate the soul. It could greatly enhance the soul's ability to condense. When Rongyi Yuishinlin heard this, his heart sank. That little girl's soul was about to disperse? Couldn't be, right? That little girl's soul was so valiant. She could even play chess with him in a soul state. What had happened to her? He was curious. At the same time, he was also concerned about Ning Shuama, his chess friend. He couldn't care less about losing another precious fruit. He immediately started to make arrangements. Yunqi volunteered, "Rongyu, I'm also worried about Miss Ning. I'll go with you." Rongyu Tianlan's busy fingers paused slightly as she glanced at Yunqi. After muttering to herself for a moment, she said, "Yunqi Dizwa, and I truly treat you as a friend. You have always been sensible, generous, and courteous. I don't wish to see any other changes in you. Some feelings that are not yours are not yours. If you force it, you might not even be able to be friends." These words were very direct. Yunqi was stunned. Her little scheme had been exposed, and she blushed. Subconsciously she retorted, "I won't." "Yes, Yunqi, I knew you wouldn't. Remember, you will only be happy if you maintain your original heart." Rongyi Yuishinlin patted her shoulder with her fan and turned to leave. He had already said everything that needed to be said. Now, it all depended on Yunqi's ability to comprehend. If Dizwa had never been tempted by anyone, he would have encouraged Yunqi to fight for him. However, Dizwa already had someone in his heart. Yunqi would only embarrass herself if she interfered. He didn't want the trio to fall apart. The pain was earth-shattering. The pain engulfed her once again. She couldn't help but scream and cry. When she opened her eyes wide, she could only see scarlet. She couldn't see anything else. She dashed left and right in this overwhelming scarlet, wanting to rush out. Rush out, rush out, rush out. Perhaps she wouldn't be in so much pain if she rushed out. Shuama, be good. I'm here. Don't be afraid." A voice seemed to pierce through the clouds. Chapter 695. His voice had the power to calm her down. It was as if she had heard it many years ago and relied on it. But she couldn't rely on him. The consequence of relying on him was despair. Han Shanhua didn't have the obligation to save her. He knew that she was in danger, but he still came back after drinking tea. In his heart, the tea was more important than her. Ning Shuama's mind was in a mess, but the conversation she overheard became her nightmare. When she heard his voice, she subconsciously shrank her body. No, she didn't want to rely on him. She wanted to rely on herself. She would break out on her own. She struggled in the sea of blood again. It was an antique clean room. The four walls of the room were painted with various complicated patterns. The patterns looked beautiful, and when combined they looked like a huge ink landscape painting. Furthermore, every dot in the drawing was clearly a talisman. These charms flowed under the light of the night pearls in the hall, like an endless tide. A faint light shot out from these charms. After a series of complicated reflections, they gathered in a big agarwood cauldron in the middle of the hall. There were red waves in the cauldron like blood rolling in the cauldron. Above the cauldron, there was a green ball-like enchantment. Ning Shuama's soul was rolling in the enchantment. She had lost her mind. The ancestor sat cross-legged on a white jade futon. He looked at Ning Shuama's soul in the green enchantment with a solemn expression. He couldn't wake Shuama up. If her mind wasn't clear, he couldn't activate the array to restore her soul. He couldn't let her recover completely. Her body was already fine. She was lying on the white jade bed in the corner of the room. As long as her soul was restored, it could be placed back into her body. But now her soul seemed to be running away from something and refused to wake up. His finger was connected to the enchantment. He could clearly feel that Shuama was afraid, she was in pain, she was struggling. But she refused to let the ancestor pull her out. She used to be like a little hedgehog. Even if she didn't want to admit it, she would subconsciously hide her thorns in front of him and rely on him. Just like that day in the carriage, when she hugged his leg and slept without any defense. But now, for some reason, she seemed to subconsciously reject him. No matter how he comforted her, it was useless. Rongyue Tianlan sat on the other side of the cauldron. His hands pressed on the cauldron. He was also looking at the restless soul in the green enchantment. She then looked at the expressionless Di Zun. Rongyu had heard everything he said to Ning Shuama just now, so she felt that her horizons had been broadened once again. It turned out that Di Zua, who had always been cold and aloof, could also comfort others when necessary. However, the ancestor's soft voice seemed to have no effect on the girl inside the enchantment. It seemed that the person this girl subconsciously trusted the most was not him. Rongyu coughed and said, Di Zua, maybe we should find someone she trusts the most and try calling her. He looked at the hourglass in the corner of the hall and frowned. We can't delay any longer. There was a time limit to doing something like this. Once the time limit was exceeded, the effect would be greatly reduced. Even if he managed to repair her soul and place it back into her original body, he was afraid that something else would happen. For example, she would lose her memory, or she would go crazy, or she would be forgetful, or she would even forget who she was. Chapter 696. The ancestor suddenly sent out a message. Call that Kirin in. This time the little Qilin was very sensitive. When Ning Shuama was brought to the quiet room for treatment, it was also left outside because it was afraid of loud noises. The only requirement here was absolute silence, which the disciples of the Sun Moon sect understood the best. Within a dozen miles there would be no sound at all, so as not to disturb the treatment inside. Although Kirin was worried about its master, it still obediently lay at the door, not daring to breathe, not even daring to move its claws like a stone Kirin statue. When the ancestor went in, he clearly told it not to use telepathy to contact Ning Shuama during this period. It was also obedient. Although it was very worried, it did not dare to use telepathy to detect Ning Shuama's recovery. Not only did it maintain absolute silence, but it also guarded against others. Not far away, the Sun Moon sect disciple guarding the door just raised his hand silently, making a sound softer than a leaf falling to the ground, but Kirin stared at him for a long time like an enemy. The person stared at him for a long time, not daring to make the slightest movement like a stone man. Kirin naturally heard the ancestor's command, and its heart jumped. It did not understand what happened, and thought that its master had an accident, so it hurriedly walked in like a cat. It held its breath and looked at the green barrier, then looked at Rongyue Tianlan and the ancestor, its eyes full of questions. Try to wake her up with telepathy. The ancestor's words were always concise. Wasn't he afraid that it would disturb its master, so he did not let it use telepathy? Kirin was full of questions, but it could not ignore the ancestor's command. It tried to call a few times, Master. Master. Master, I am Little Apple. Master. The restless soul in the barrier suddenly stopped, no longer blindly rushing left and right, as if it was listening to something. There was a door. Rongyue Tianlan's eyes lit up, and he signaled Kiran to continue. Kiran's spirits were lifted as well. He called out to her a few more times. Master, wake up. You're out of danger. You're safe now. Wake up. We're all here. The rampaging soul trembled a few times before a hoarse voice could be heard. Little apple? Her consciousness had been pulled back. Everyone was overjoyed. Rongyue Tianlan was secretly happy and blurted out. It turns out that she trusts this Kiran the most at the critical moment. As soon as he finished speaking, he seemed to feel that it was inappropriate and shot a glance at the ancestor. The ancestor was expressionless. His eyes were fixed on Ning Shuama's soul, as if he didn't hear Rongyue Tianlan's words. Kiran was overjoyed and immediately said, "It's me, Master. It's me. You can see me, right?" There was a wisp of smoke moving around the soul, as if Ning Shuama was trying her best to push aside the fog and look outside. Her soul was so distorted that it did not look like a human. Kiran could not see her face even with its eyes wide open. However, it could feel that Ning Shuama seemed to see it, and she even stretched out her hand to it. Now is the time. The ancestor and Rongyue Tianlan worked at the same time, and the green barrier was removed. At the same time, a wave of red light popped out from the cauldron and directly covered Ning Shuama's soul, pulling it into the cauldron. Chapter 697. Ning Shuama's soul was only a little bit awakened. She was not fully awake yet. All her reactions were still instinctive. She felt that she had finally followed Kiran's voice and pushed away the blood fog, allowing her to take a breath. But she did not expect that before she could take a breath, a large sea of blood would hit her in the face. She seemed to have thought of something. Her whole body trembled, and she struggled vigorously in the red light. She seemed to be afraid of this big cauldron. Kiran's heart was raised high. Dizun naturally also noticed this problem. He was a little startled, and immediately thought of something. His face changed slightly, and he quickly whispered to Kiran, "Tell her, this is not the soul-refining cauldron. This is the Anxing pool. It is used to heal her. As long as she obediently cooperates, it will not hurt anymore." Kiran immediately passed his words to Ning Shuama. Ning Shuama's body trembled. Finally she stopped struggling, but she was still trembling. After trembling for a moment, she still asked, Really? Really? More real than real gold. Master, this little Qilin only wants the best for you. It absolutely won't lie to you." The little Qilin repeatedly comforted her and guided her movements according to the ancestor's instructions. "Master, relax and relax. Close your eyes and use your inner vision to sense yourself." In the red light, Ning Shuama listened to Kiran's words. Although her body was still trembling from the pain, she still followed Kiran's instructions step by step. It seemed that she trusted Kiran very much. And Dizun, who was Han Shangyue, obviously did not trust her husband enough. Rongyue Tianlan almost could not bear to look at Dizun's cold face. "Rongyue, if you are not afraid of being slapped out of Buddha Lotus Mountain by me, then go ahead and be absent-minded." Dizun's cold voice passed into Rongyue Tianlan's ears. Rongyue Tianlan coughed and did not dare to be absent-minded again. He worked together with Dizun to operate the big cauldron. The liquid in the cauldron began to circulate slowly. It slowly climbed up and reached the red barrier. Like blood veins, they crisscrossed on the red barrier and slowly extended to Ning Shuama's messy soul. They were like warm water that moistened and corrected the messy soul. This period of time was long and thrilling. Kiran didn't even dare to breathe loudly. It only dared to speak when the ancestor asked it to, lest it take a wrong step and push its master into eternal damnation. Ning Shuama felt the pain in her soul gradually lessen as the blood vessels in the red light circulated. She could feel that her organs were slowly returning to their original positions, and she was no longer in so much pain. This calmed her down a lot, and she followed Kiran's instructions step by step. During this period of time, the ancestor felt that it was too troublesome to pass messages back and forth, so he simply gave the orders himself. However, Ning Shuama didn't listen to him at all. The moment he opened his mouth, she shrank back instead, helplessly. He could only let Kiran continue to command. Dizun's complexion was not good. Rongyue Tianlan tried his best not to look at Dizun's face. Otherwise, if he laughed out unkindly, the ancestor would fly into a rage out of humiliation and slap him out. The two peerless experts joined hands to calm down Ning Shuama's soul and heal her. The efficiency was naturally very high. In addition, Ning Shuama was very smart and her willpower was also very strong. She was in so much pain and was not very clear-headed, but she could still follow Kiran's commands and actions. She did not do a bad job at all. Even Rongyue Tianlan, who was experienced and knowledgeable, was amazed. When half of the blood-red liquid in the cauldron was consumed, Ning Shuama's soul finally returned to its original appearance. She was probably exhausted to the extreme. The moment she recovered, she closed her eyes and fell asleep. Rongyue Tianlan was also tired. He felt that all the bones in his body were about to fall apart. He wanted to find a place to sleep. He couldn't help but glance at Di Zun again. This time, Di Zun was in charge of the treatment, so he would only be more tired. Moreover, he had just used the earth-shrinking technique and the 1,000 miles in a breath technique. Now the old man was able to sit there without fainting. That was already very impressive. Ning Shuama's soul had been placed back into her body. Rongyue Tianlan watched as the girl gradually regained her breath. Her face gradually turned red. This meant that it was very successful. They had successfully saved the girl who was on the verge of death. Chapter 699. As long as she had a good night's sleep, she would be able to wake up the next morning. After 3 to 5 days of rest, she would be as lively as before. Dizwa, do you want to take a rest? I'll take care of things here. Rongyue Tianlan felt that the ancestor's face was a little pale. He was afraid that the ancestor would be worried, so he added, "Don't worry, I won't leave before you come back. Even if this girl wakes up and stabs me with a knife, I won't leave." The ancestor sat there without speaking, as if he was troubled by something. He looked out of the window lost in thought. Dizwa, do you have something on your mind? Rongyue Tianlan was keenly aware of the ancestor's abnormality. The ancestor's most common expression was expressionless, indifferent, and indifferent. It was very difficult to see any emotion on his face. Rongyue Tianlan had known him for so long, but he had never seen him lose his mind. A person like him was too strong, and there were very few things in this world that he couldn't solve. No matter what sort of troublesome matter occurred, he was always able to make arrangements in an orderly manner. It was fine if he didn't make a move, but when he did, it would definitely be like a bolt of lightning that swept through everything in an all-powerful manner. There was utterly no one capable of resisting his sharpness. When the matter was solved, it naturally wouldn't become a worry for him. Today, Ning Shuama had clearly been rescued, and she would wake up tomorrow at the latest. So where did the ancestor's worry come from? It was very rare for the ancestor to show such an expression. Rongyue Tianlan was concerned, and his gossipy mood began to burn. The ancestor's eyes swept over Rongyue Tianlan. He pondered for a moment, then suddenly asked, "Rong, you can be considered a playboy. You should be able to understand a woman's thoughts, right?" How rare. The ancestor, who didn't touch the secular world, actually began to pay attention to a woman's thoughts. Rongyue Tianlan took out his folding fan, opened it and waved it coquettishly. He said rather reservedly, "I know a little. Why don't you tell me what's difficult for the ancestor?" The ancestor pondered for a moment. There was a woman who was in danger. She heard that her husband was going to save her, so she tried her best to stall for time, waiting for her husband to save her. In the end, her husband didn't save her because he was a little unhappy. Instead, he went to the tea house to drink a few cups of tea and missed the best time to save her. Let her fall into the enemy's hands and suffer. Will this woman forgive her husband easily? Rongyue Tianlan. He blurted out, "Is her husband sick?" His wife is in danger, yet he still has the heart to drink tea. After seeing Dizwa's unfriendly expression, Rongyue finally reacted and carefully asked, "Ancestor, may I ask why her husband went to the tea house to drink tea?" As the saying goes, saving a soldier is like putting out a fire. Dizwa, what are you trying to do? You were clearly in a hurry when you left, and you even used forbidden techniques in succession. Why was he drinking tea when he was almost there? This didn't make any sense. The ancestor glanced at him and said, "Don't worry about these minor details. I just want to ask you if this woman knows about this matter. Will she forgive you easily? Emperor's throne, this is the main branch, okay? How is this a minor detail? Alright, it would be difficult to get the truth out of Dizwa's mouth. He decided not to ask. Rongyuetianlan looked at Ning Shuoma lying there and then looked at the ancestor. Dizwa, do you want me to tell you the truth? Chapter 700. Nonsense. Dizun replied straightforwardly. Rongyuetianlan shook his fan and sighed. It's difficult. A woman's mind is very sharp. If she knows the truth, she will completely fall out with her husband. Well, the degree of falling out will be proportional to how much she has suffered. Dizun's thin lips were slightly pursed, and his face was even worse. Rongyuetianlan thought for a moment and comforted him, however, if her husband knows his mistake after this, and goes to his wife's room to beg for forgiveness, kowtow a few more times, and coax her with soft words for a period of time, she might forgive him. Women are more fickle and easily moved. Seeing her husband's sincere repentance, she may forgive him. Dizun frowned even more. Ask for forgiveness? Kowtow? He felt his hair stand on end just thinking about it. This won't do, think of a more reliable one. Dizun's eyes were bright as he looked at Rongyuetianlan. Rongyuetianlan almost scratched his head. He had offended her so much. He didn't even want to ask for forgiveness. He coughed. If her husband can't put down his face, he can slowly reform her. For example, he can give her peaches today and clothes tomorrow. After a long time, she will slowly be reformed. She doesn't care about these. Dizun simply cut off his words. This girl actually has a lot of money. Naturally, she can buy whatever she wants. How can she be interested in such trivial things? You call yourself a playboy. Can't you think of a more reliable one? Rongyuetianlan also became ruthless. There is another way. It is said that it is very effective. It is a magic weapon that some men use every time. Dizun's eyes lit up slightly. Tell me. Rongyuetianlan coughed and opened his mouth. It seemed that it was difficult to speak. But under Dizun's gaze he could only say, some women like strong men. No matter how much a man offends her, as long as the man subdues her and then drags her to bed, after doing it for a while, under normal circumstances, the woman's anger will dissipate. Dizun. This works. Is there something wrong with the man or the woman? He looked at Rongyuetianlan. Have you tried this method? Rongyuetianlan touched his nose. How can such an elegant man like me do such a beastly thing? Dizun looked at him with an unkind gaze. He knew that it was a beastly thing, yet he still wanted him to do it? Rongyuetianlan thought of a few more ideas, but they were all rejected by the ancestor. He knew Ning Shuoma's temper, and these were not suitable. In the end, Rongyuetianlan was also helpless. He spread out his hands and said, then it's better to beat her until she loses her memory and forgets these things. He was just saying it in a fit of pique. Unexpectedly, the ancestor's eyes lit up slightly. He finally stood up and said, you finally came up with a reliable idea. Rongyuetianlan was dumbstruck as he looked at Dizwa rolling up his sleeves. He couldn't help but reach out his fan and hook it on the ancestor's sleeve. Dizwa, you don't really want to hit her, do you? She's actually quite weak. She probably won't be able to take a hit from you. The ancestor flicked his sleeve and flicked the fan away. He said indifferently, how can this venerable be so violent? I have other ways to make her forget all the unpleasant things. Rongyuetianlan. He watched as the ancestor walked over and used a spell to erase the woman's memory. Chapter 701. Dizwa, your method is also very simple and crude, okay? Moreover, if a person's memory is repeatedly erased, she will feel a little confused, and some things can't be connected. You can't erase too much. Dizwa, maybe she doesn't know that you went to the tea house to drink tea, so she won't blame you. Rongyuetianlan struggled to say, take it easy. The ancestor said indifferently, she must have heard my conversation with Kiran. Otherwise, she wouldn't have rejected me so much during the treatment. This was the first time he came into contact with such matters, so he wasn't sure. However, his deductive ability was not ordinary. When he connected the dots between Ning Shuoma's attitude towards him, he immediately understood what was going on. Rongyuetianlan was speechless. So that Kiran's memory has to be erased again? The ancestor didn't say anything, so he naturally agreed. Since he had the intention to do something, he naturally wouldn't leave any future troubles for himself. Rongyue Tianlan waved his fan and didn't say anything. Once the ancestor decided on something, even 10 immortals couldn't change it. He could only light a candle for Ning Xuema in his heart. Being loved by a man like the ancestor, he really didn't know whether it was her fortune or misfortune. Dizwa, now that you've returned to the Sun Moon sect, will you interact with her as Han Shangyue or as the ancestor? This was what Rongyue Tianlan was most concerned about. The ancestor slightly frowned and said indifferently, "You don't have to worry about this." His eyes swept over Ning Xuema. She didn't seem to have any real feelings for Han Shangyue. She always rejected being his concubine and always thought that she was a shield. This wasn't a good start. Maybe he should erase Han Shangyue from her memory? However, the time that Han Shangyue had been with her wasn't short, so he had a lot of memories. If he erased them all at once, Ning Xuema's memory would be damaged. Moreover, Han Shangyue was the identity that he often used in the lower bound. He still had to use this identity to do some things. He couldn't let this name disappear. He looked down and began to think of a way to satisfy both sides. After all, Rongyue Tianlan had known him for many years and understood the ancestor's temperament quite well. Looking at his expression, he had the impulse to light a candle for Ning Xuema again. The little girl was indeed very smart, but she was up against an ancestor who had lived for thousands of years, experienced countless storms, and calmed countless storms. She was obviously not his match. "It hurts?" Ning Xuema, who had been sleeping all this time, suddenly murmured. It was a very low sentence, but it made the two men present turn their heads at the same time. On the white jade couch, Ning Xuema's thin brows were slightly furrowed. She seemed to be in pain. The overlord, who was standing in front of the window with Rongyue and Tianlan, appeared in front of the white jade bed in the blink of an eye. He sat beside her and picked up one of her wrists to check her pulse. Rongyue Tianlan was still worried and walked over. "How is it? Why does it still hurt?" Dizun put down Ning Xuema's hand and said indifferently, "It's not really painful. It's just that she has been in pain for too long, so it's become a kind of subconscious pain." Rongyue Tianlan nodded and felt relieved. He had a good impression of this little girl, and didn't want her to suffer anymore. Dizun glanced at him and seemed a little strange. "Why are you still here?" Rongyue Tianlan was speechless. "Dizwa, you're too quick to burn the bridge after crossing the river." He tapped the space between his eyebrows with his fan, and was about to bid farewell when... Chapter 702. Ning Xuema, who was lying on the white jade bed, suddenly clenched her fists and murmured, "I want to become strong." Rongyue Tianlan waved his fan and couldn't help but smile. It seemed that the little girl was stimulated. She was already very strong, so strong that even he, who had never put any mortals in his eyes, couldn't help but have a whole new level of respect for her. The ancestor raised his hand and pried open her clenched fists one by one. Then he interlocked his fingers with hers. His voice was faint, but there was a hint of persuasion in it. "If you want to become strong, you have to acknowledge a master." Ning Xuema actually didn't wake up. She was talking in her sleep. When a person was talking in their sleep, if someone interrupted, the person talking in their sleep would sometimes continue, "Acknowledge a master." Who is the best one to acknowledge? Since you want to acknowledge a master, then acknowledge the strongest person. Who is the strongest person in the world? The ancestor responded slowly, as if he was a big bad wolf luring Little Red Riding Hood. The ancestor. This time, Ning Xuema answered without hesitation. Even in her sleep she understood very well. "Not bad, you are very smart. Then you should acknowledge the ancestor as your master." The ancestor seemed very satisfied. Ning Xuema twisted her thin eyebrows. She seemed to feel that something was wrong, but she couldn't react in her sleep. She turned over and murmured something again. This time the words were vague and no one could hear it clearly. Rongyue Tianlan, who was watching them from the side, almost dropped his fan on the ground. "Dizwa, you don't really want to accept her as your disciple, do you?" He finally couldn't help but ask. The ancestor tucked Ning Xuema's little hand into the quilt and casually replied, "Why not? But don't you want her to be your concubine? Dizwa, you like her. How can she be your disciple? She doesn't like that identity." The ancestor's voice was calm. Then you let her be your disciple? Then you will treat her in the future. Rongyue Tianlan couldn't keep up with the ancestor's thoughts. I will treat her as I should. It won't change because of her identity. In other words, Di Zun still wanted this girl. But if she becomes your disciple, it seems inappropriate for your relationship to be like this. Rongyu Tianlan said without fear of death. You mean a master-disciple relationship? The ancestor simply said it for him. What a trendy word. Rongyue Tianlan nodded. I'm afraid that the love between master and disciple will not be tolerated by the secular world. Since when did I care about such worldly things? The ancestor retorted. Rongyue Tianlan. He had nothing to say. The ancestor really didn't care about what others said. Moreover, the more he liked to do things that were out of line, the more he liked to make people's eyes pop out. In Rongyue Tianlan's words, the ancestor had lived for too long and was too idle. Dizwa, you actually have other identities with her. Why must you be master and disciple? This was what Rongyue Tianlan was puzzled about. The ancestor was obviously moved by this little girl. If he didn't know his own feelings, he would have thought that it was out of pity for her talent. It was understandable that he would want to accept her as his disciple. But he clearly knew what he wanted, and yet he still accepted her as his disciple, which was a little puzzling. The ancestor looked down at Ning Shuama on the bed and said indifferently, she hates a master-disciple relationship. Rongyue Tianlan. Dizwa, you know that there are tigers on the mountain, but you still want to go there? She also made up some rumors about this master-disciple relationship. Chapter 703. So, Rongyu Tianlan raised his eyebrows. So I'll just sit on her body. I can't let Shuama's lies go to waste. Rongyu Tianlan was completely speechless. Well, when the overlord's bad taste came up, even the gods couldn't stop him. Little girl, you're on your own. There was a vast and misty lake. The shore was paved with jade cobblestones, and there was a waterside pavilion in the lake. The pavilion was made of tortoiseshell, and the walls were made of green jade. It looked like a crystal palace in the lake. A coral path led to the waterside pavilion. A man in white stepped on the coral path and floated over. Before he arrived, a disciple of the Sun Moon sect rushed out and bowed to the ground. Overlord. The overlord nodded slightly and asked, how is he? The disciple respectfully said, I've already given him the best medicine. His injuries are fine, and his physical strength has also recovered. He has already woken up. The overlord nodded and strode in. The disciple naturally waited outside. He was sent by the overlord to take care of the shark men. Without the overlord's order, he wouldn't leave without permission. On the glass couch in the waterside pavilion, Yifeng reclined there with his eyes closed, as if he was sleeping. His beautiful fishtail flapped gently, flashing a faint blue light in the pearl light. The door gently creaked, and he immediately became alert. He opened his eyes, and the moment he saw who it was, he immediately sat up straight, crossed his arms and saluted. This was the highest salute of the merman race. Ancestor. The overlord nodded slightly and glanced at him. You've lost 650 years of power. Yifeng was stunned, and a touch of admiration flashed through his eyes. He bowed his head. The overlord has a good eye. His judgment was not wrong at all. He was plotted against by Shuailan on the ship that day. He was poisoned and lost 500 years of power, so he could no longer maintain his human form and could only appear in the form of a mermaid. As for Yi Qinghuan, his shoulder blade was pierced by her, and coupled with the desperate escape, he lost a lot of vitality. He had also lost more than 100 years of psychokinesis. Right now, Yifeng had to stay close to the water. Otherwise, the scales on his body would dry up and he would feel uncomfortable. Even his breathing would become dry. Not only that, he had to soak in the water every 2 hours. Otherwise, his body wouldn't be able to take it. Why don't you return to the sea? The ancestor looked down at him, the white jade mask on his face glittering. Yifeng froze, unable to answer. Yes, he had already become like this. Even if Yan Ziyuan didn't marry that Guzian, it would be impossible for him and her to be together. Even simply staying by her side had become an extravagant hope. He should have returned to the sea, to his own race. But he couldn't bear to. Chapter 704. No matter what Yi Feng did, Yi would never fall in love with him. Yi's lover would always be someone else. Since you know, why can't you let it go? The ancestor sat down on a chair beside him. He looked like he was going to have a long talk. Of course, the chair had been cleaned by him with the cleaning spell. It was cleaner than washing it with alcohol. Yi Feng paused for a moment. I just want to see her well. He just wanted to silently protect her and see her happy. But even he couldn't do that. He lowered his eyes sadly. A jade-like palm appeared in front of Yi Feng. There was a red fruit in the palm. It was as moist as a coral bean. It was the size of an apricot. Shone faintly. Yi Feng knew what it was. He suddenly raised his head and looked at the fruit. Then he looked at the ancestor. His voice trembled slightly. Ancestor, this was the red light fruit. It was a divine fruit that could only be found by chance. It could strengthen the spiritual power of the people of the Water Tribe for 300 years. It was a treasure that the people of the Water Tribe dreamed of. This fruit was much more precious to Sharkmen than the 1,000-year Ganoderma and 1,000-year ginseng. As long as he absorbed this fruit, he could regain his human form and his identity as Yi Feng. This fruit was priceless. Not only did the ancestor save him, but he also gave him such a precious fruit. Yi Feng had always been calm. At this moment he was like a miser who was suddenly hit in the head by a big gold ingot. He was a little confused and couldn't believe it. The ancestor didn't bother to answer his nonsense. He threw the fruit to him. This is all I can do for you. Yi Feng solemnly put away the fruit. He took a deep breath and bowed to the ancestor again. Thank you for your kindness. If the ancestor needs anything in the future, Yi Feng will not hesitate to go through water and tread on fire. The ancestor stood up and said indifferently, It was Ning Shuama who wanted to save you. You can consider this favor to her. He turned around and left. Yi Feng paused for a moment. Ancestor, I wonder if I can leave the Sun Moon sect for a few days? The ancestor's footsteps didn't stop as he said indifferently, You can leave at any time. The Sun Moon sect has no intention of keeping you here. At first, Yi Feng thought that the ancestor had saved him because there was a shortage of mermaids on the continent. He thought that the ancestor would force him to stay on the mountain. She didn't expect that. He really just wanted to save her once. If that was the case, once he recovered, he could go and do his own things. The ancestor didn't like to meddle in other people's business, and the whole continent knew that. His willingness to help this time was an unexpected surprise. Who on earth was Ning Shuama? She was able to make the ancestor make an exception for her. Yi Feng took another deep breath, and Ning Shuama's figure flashed through his mind. He secretly made up his mind that he would find a way to repay Ning Shuama in the future, and repay this enormous favor. Ning Shuama sat on the bed in a daze. To be honest, she was a little confused. She was sitting on a strange wooden bed with a soft bedding that was as light as a cloud. The light blue bed curtains were layered and flowed like water. There was a pond of green lotuses painted on the curtains. When she moved them, it was as if she was stirring a pond of spring waves. The green leaves in the water and the lotus flowers flowed in the wind. The scenery was extremely beautiful. She didn't know what material the bed curtains were made of, but they were as light as clouds and as thin as gauze. When she touched them, it was slightly warm and smooth, as if it could melt in the palm of her hand and become a pool of blue water. Ning Shuama sat on the bed and looked around. She felt like she was sitting on a boat surrounded by lotus ponds. There was even a faint lotus fragrance in the air. It was very light, but it seeped into her heart. Ning Shuama raised her hand to touch the bed curtains, and then touched the bedding below her. This place looked simple, but it was extremely low-key and luxurious. Chapter 705. Ning Shuama had never laid on such a comfortable bed in her life. She had never seen such a picturesque bed curtain. Even the palace might not have this kind of bed curtain, right? She had never seen this kind of material in the presidential suite of the modern era. How did she end up sleeping here? What was this place? She rubbed her eyebrows and tried her best to think. The past events came back to her mind. She was turned into a cat by Yi Qinghuan and escaped with Yi Feng. They escaped and escaped, but in the end, they couldn't escape from that woman's pursuit. She and Yi Feng were captured, And then she was tortured by Yi Qingluan in all kinds of ways, living a life worse than death. Her last impression was that woman carried her to a big cauldron. The oil in the cauldron was boiling, and that woman said she was going to put her in the oil. Then she had no impression of it at all. The only feeling she had was the pain that penetrated her bone marrow and the overwhelming redness. Did she die again? Did she possess the body of some noble lady again? Otherwise, how could she escape from the hands of that perverted woman? And sleep on such a good bed? Ning Xuema touched her face subconsciously. It was warm and smooth, and her skin was very young. She looked at her hands again. Her eyes lit up. Her small hands were white and tender. Her nails were pink, slender like jade and tender like spring onions. This was clearly her former hand. Could it be that she had returned to her own body? She lifted the quilt without a word, opened the gauze curtain, jumped off the bed and looked at herself in front of the dressing mirror. The girl in the mirror had black hair covering her forehead. Her eyebrows were curved, her eyelashes were long, her eyes were big, and her mouth was small. It was her former appearance. Not a single bit off. Ha ha ha, she was actually back. She was back in her own body. She seemed to have thought of something and hurriedly lifted her skirt to look at her feet. That pair of bare feet stepped on the wooden floor. They were slender like a crescent bow, white like crystal and pink like pearls. They were round and cute. Her feet had also recovered. Rongyue Tianlan's method was really effective. He really healed her feet. Ning Xuema was overjoyed. She stood on the spot and turned in a circle. Her yellow skirt fluttered in the wind, like flowers blooming in the spring. After being happy for a while, another question surfaced in his mind. She remembered that before her body entered the mud shell, she was wearing a set of special clothes from head to toe. That set of clothes looked like a bell worn by monks, but it was effective so that her body would not be injured. Now that she had recovered, who was the one who put this light yellow dress on her? She vaguely felt that there were no maids in Rongyu's residence, only a small servant. She checked the dress she was wearing. The material of the dress was excellent. It was as smooth as water and very comfortable to wear. The embroidery on it was exquisite and the size was quite suitable. It was as if it was specially made for him. Coupled with her hairstyle, she looked indescribably cute and lively. This outfit matched her temperament very well. Ning Xuema smiled at the mirror, and the girl in the mirror smiled back at her. She was stunningly beautiful. She raised her hand and touched her face. She seemed to have become more tender. After soaking in the hot spring, she looked like she was 18 years old. But now she looked like a 15-year-old girl. Her skin was so tender that it seemed like water would come out with a pinch. Her body couldn't have shrunk, right? She lowered her head and looked at her chest. It was still handsome and tall, with a slender waist. This figure was simply too devilish. Chapter 706. Lolita Face, Devilish Figure. This was the most realistic portrayal of her now. Ning Xuema was satisfied. At this time, she finally had the heart to look at the furnishings around her. The screen, the flower rack, the table, the cauldron that emitted a delicate fragrance. Every single one of them was quaint and exquisite, which was pleasing to the eye. This kind of room was not something that ordinary people could afford to live in. Was this still Rongyue Tianlan's island? The sunlight shone in through the window, bringing with it a slight warmth, jumping in the room, jumping in her palms, making her slightly impetuous heart calm down. Tranquil, serene and sunny. Ning Xuema let out a light sigh of relief. It seemed that she had not tasted this kind of peaceful time for a long time. Her expression was absent-minded for a moment, being forced to turn into a cat, running for her life, being captured and tortured. As if it was just a nightmare, waking up and the flowers were still blooming. The sun was even better. That should not be a nightmare, right? It was so specific, so thrilling, it was not something that a nightmare could contain. Moreover, she had never remembered the dreams that she had in her life. But she remembered this very clearly. The scenes at that time could be replayed in her mind like a movie. However, she felt that she seemed to have forgotten something, lost something. It seemed like she had forgotten a small episode, but she could not remember what it was exactly. The sound of the flute drifted in, rippling like the spring breeze, with the power to calm people, as if it could heal all the wounds. Ning Xuema's heart jumped. This flute sound made her heart palpitate for no reason, as if she had heard it many years ago, and was fascinated by it. She put on her shoes and ran out. The scenery in the courtyard made her startled. This courtyard was not big, with white walls and green tiles. There were bamboo and big stones in the courtyard. The layout was ingenious, but it gave her a faint sense of familiarity. The flute sound came from outside the courtyard. The green leaves in the wind flipped and danced with the flute sound. It was already late autumn. The courtyard was slightly cold. Ning Xuema thought for a moment, then ran back to the house to find a cloak and put it on, then ran out of the courtyard. If she didn't guess wrongly, this flute sound should be played by Rongyue Tianlan, the romantic young master. After all, this was his home. Only someone as talented as him could play such a heart-wrenching flute. Since he had saved him, he ought to go and thank him. At the same time, he could also ask about Yifeng's whereabouts. It was a completely different world outside the courtyard. The moment Ning Xuema saw the scenery outside, her heart skipped a beat. The Phoenix Pavilion and the Dragon Tower are connected to the heavens. The jade tree and the jade branches are like the smoke of wisteria. These two lines were a true portrayal of the architecture here. White jade was used as bricks while green jade was used as tiles. Pavilions, terraces, and towers rose and fell continuously. They were built along the mountainous terrain, as if they could directly reach the heavens. It was grander and more majestic than the imperial palace she had seen before. The imperial palace gave her a feeling of splendor, but this place gave her the feeling of an ancient temple, holy and solemn. This wasn't what surprised Ning Xuema, but the layout and style of the building reminded her of a place, the place where Yi Qinghuan of the Bright Reverence sect lived. But compared to this place, Yi Qinghuan's place was like a knockoff. The quality of the materials was not as good as here, the size was not as good as here. Her place was like a small building compared to here. With Yi Qinghuan's obsession with the Venerable D, she should have cloned the place where the Venerable D lived. She wouldn't have cloned Rongyue Tianlan's island layout. Chapter 707. Could this be the territory of the Sun Moon sect's Venerable Emperor? Ning Xuema was startled by her own thoughts. She carefully sized up the layout of this place. Then she discovered that this place was different from Yi Qinghuan's place. There was an extremely magnificent main hall in front of her, but Yi Qinghuan's place didn't have it. Yi Qinghuan seemed to have turned this side hall into the main hall. She had completely removed the layout of this side hall. Ning Xuema turned around and looked at the courtyard she had run out of. The more she looked, the more it resembled the main hall of Bright Reverence. A thought flashed through her mind. Could it be that the place she had woken up in was where Yi Qinghuan had once lived? She inexplicably shivered. At this moment she finally determined that this was the Sun Moon sect. If she wasn't wrong, then the main hall not too far away was where the Venerable Emperor lived. After Yi Qinghuan was expelled from the Sun Moon sect, she had been unwilling to accept this. Thus, she had simply moved the layout of this side hall over to the Venerable Emperor. It was as if she hadn't left the Sun Moon sect and was still living in her former courtyard. Ning Xuema couldn't help but flick her clothes, as if she wanted to flick off the dust from the courtyard. She took a deep breath. She now understood that being captured by Yi Qinghuan last night wasn't a dream. This was the first time she had come to the Sun Moon sect and the first time she had seen the layout of this place. This was also the first time she had gone to Bright Reverence. If she had relied on her imagination alone, it would have been impossible for her to have seen the layout of this place. Her body had originally been at Carefree Island, and her soul had nearly been thrown into a frying pan by Yi Qinghuan. Now that she had woken up, she was actually in the residence of the Sun Moon sect's Venerable Emperor. Had the Venerable Emperor arrived at the critical moment and rescued her? The more she thought about it, the more likely this seemed. She simply ran towards the sound of the flute. She ran past the main hall and followed the sound of the flute through a bamboo forest. In the depths of the bamboo forest, she could see the tip of a pagoda. And at the top of the pagoda, she could faintly see a person sitting there. From a bit further away, that person's figure was blurry. Ning Xuema could only make out the person's fluttering white clothes and fluttering black hair. Ning Xuema's steps paused for a moment. That person was like a high and mighty emperor. Ning Xuema had been running around for a long time, but she hadn't seen anyone else, not even a servant girl. If it weren't for the sound of the flute, Ning Xuema would have suspected that she was the only living person on this mountain. She had vaguely heard from Jiyunhuang that the ancestor lived alone in the Sun-Moon sect. Apart from his direct disciples, no one was allowed to enter the heavenly sound peak without his permission. Ning Xuema looked at the person on the top of the tower and paused for a moment. In the end, she still ran over. She ran over and found that the pagoda was not built in the bamboo forest, but on a lonely mountain peak. The mountain was surrounded by steep cliffs, and was only connected to the surroundings by a chain. Ning Xuema felt that this layout was similar to the demon ceiling tower in the Legend of Sword and Fairy. However, the demon ceiling tower in the game was greenish-black, and gave people a gloomy feeling. But here it was a standard white pagoda. The color was like colored glass. The sunlight was refracted by it, as if it had a Buddhist aura. She finally saw the person sitting on the top of the pagoda clearly. A wide white robe, a white jade mask, and long hair as black as night, the standard attire of the ancestor. He held a white jade flute in his hand and played it by his lips. The flute was originally a mournful tune, but when played by him it was peaceful. It was like a spring drizzle, like a flower blooming in the wind. It made people's restless hearts calm down. Above the top of the pagoda, there were white cranes flying gracefully, as if they were dancing to the flute. Chapter 708. Ning Xuema seemed to have sensed something. She looked around and saw birds and beasts of all sizes perched on the peaks of the bamboo forest. They were all listening to the music with their heads tilted to one side. They seemed to be very satisfied and absorbed in the music. Ning Xuema was speechless. She had heard of the story of the flute attracting the phoenix, but she thought it was just a myth. She didn't expect to see the real version. The ancestor's flute attracted countless birds and beasts. They danced and listened attentively. This scene was shocking enough. Ning Xuema was also shocked by this scene. She stood there in a daze for a while. She felt like she had seen this scene before, but she couldn't remember where. She had a feeling of déjà vu. She simply sat down and hugged her knees as she watched him play. When the song ended, the music lingered in the air. The white-clothed ancestor stood up and looked down at her. He said faintly, "Do you want to play a song with me?" His voice was like an echo in an empty valley. It seemed to carry a misty cloud and a faint fragrance of the Queen of the Night. It was unbelievably pleasant to hear. Ning Xuema looked up at him. In theory, this should be the second time she met the ancestor. The first time was in Chongkong Country's imperial palace. She was almost frozen into an ice sculpture by him. The second time was now. Ning Xuema patted her hands and looked up at him. Xuema is afraid of the ancestor's love. It's just that Xuema didn't bring a musical instrument, so I can't play with you. What musical instrument are you good at? The ancestor seemed to be very talkative. Ning Xuema thought for a moment. Pipa. She was actually best at the zither, but because of Shuilan she had a shadow over the zither. The ancestor's eyes flickered slightly. He waved his sleeve and a purple light flashed in front of Ning Xuema. A pipa appeared on a big rock in front of her. Naturally, the things given by the ancestor were the rarest treasures in the world. Ning Xuema picked up the pipa and looked at it. It was a jade pipa. From the large surface of the jade pipa to the small shaft that held the strings tightly, everything was so perfect. Compared to the pipa that Ning Xuema had played in the palace, it was much better than the Milky Way. Holding such a precious pipa, Ning Xuema had the urge to cut her nails. He was afraid that if he used too much force, he would leave a scratch on it and destroy this perfection. Di Zun looked at her. "What do you want to play?" She had to choose. Ning Xuema said, "Di Zun, please go first. Xuema will follow." The ancestor glanced at her again. Her attitude was respectful and courteous, natural and unrestrained. There was nothing wrong with it. However, the ancestor's eyes faintly deepened. He just nodded. "Okay, you follow." The flute sounded again. Ning Xuema's fingers that were holding the pipa tightened. She suddenly looked up at him. The white-clothed ancestor lowered his eyes. He was playing the same pipa song that she had played at the banquet in Chongkong Country. What did he mean by playing this song at this time? Ning Xuema's mood suddenly became chaotic. She faintly felt that something was different. Di Zun was a smart person. Naturally, he wouldn't forget where he had heard this song. Now he was playing it in front of her. Was he trying to confess his identity? Hello. The ancestor's voice floated in her mind. She looked up and saw the ancestor looking at her. She couldn't see the color of his eyes clearly from the distance. She only faintly felt that his gaze was glued to her body. This feeling made Ning Xuema's heart beat faster. Chapter 709. Ning Xuema began to play the flute. Her mood was slightly disturbed, so the sound of the pipa she played wasn't as perfect as it used to be. The ancestor seemed to have sensed her absent-mindedness, so he played her pipa a few times, but to no avail. Ning Xuema played a few wrong beats, so the noise naturally didn't attract the birds and beasts, so they all dispersed. When the flute stopped, Ning Xuema also stopped. She was a little embarrassed and she didn't know why, but she had an impulse to run away. She could sense that the ancestor in white was watching her from the top of the tower, as if he was studying her. Being stared at by him like this, Ning Xuema only felt her scalp faintly numb. She did not know what he was plotting. She coughed and said, "Xuema came here to thank the ancestor." "Thank me for what?" "Thank you for saving my life, ancestor. You and I must be so polite?" The ancestor's voice came faintly. Ning Xuema smiled faintly and said, "I'm not being polite, this is what I should do." The ancestor on the top of the tower didn't speak for a moment. The mountain wind blew between the white tower and the mountain, making a whistling sound. The ancestor didn't speak again, and Ning Xuema also didn't speak. There was a moment of silence. If it weren't for the mountain wind blowing and the occasional bird chirping in the distance, Ning Xuema could almost hear her own breathing and heartbeat. This kind of atmosphere made people feel a little uneasy, so Ning Xuema's first thought was to retreat. She raised her head and smiled. "Ancestor, Xuema still has one more thing to ask." "Go ahead." "There was a friend who was in danger with me. I don't know if he—" Ning Xuema thought of Yifeng. The ancestor's eyes deepened slightly. "He is your friend? What kind of friend?" Ning Xuema faintly furrowed her brows, but she still answered truthfully with only 4 words, "Life and death friends." As the wind blew, the air on the mountaintop seemed even colder. After a moment of silence, the venerable sovereign finally answered, "I've already rescued him." Ning Xuema's eyes lit up. Yifeng was indeed saved. She felt as if a large stone had been lifted from her heart. She blurted out, "How is he?" Her concern was obvious. "Di Zun." The aura around him became even colder. "He is in the celestial water lake. Since you are so concerned, why don't you go and see him yourself?" Before he could finish his sentence, he paused. Because Ning Xuema actually turned around and ran away. She did not forget the etiquette she should have before leaving. "Many thanks, Di Zun. I'll go and see him now." His voice soon dissipated in the air. In the blink of an eye, she ran into the bamboo forest and disappeared. She actually abandoned him just like that. Di Zun sat at the top of the white tower, not knowing how to react. As the wind blew, his white robe fluttered, making his figure look slightly desolate and lonely. Didn't Kiran say that before Xuema was caught by Yi Qinghuan, she had something to say to him? Then why didn't she say anything now that she had seen him? Did she forget? That's not right. When I erased her memory, I only erased the conversation between her and Kiran, as well as a small part of her memory. Logically speaking, if she really had something to say to him, she shouldn't have forgotten it. Also, her attitude towards him seemed a bit strange. It seemed that they had become estranged again. He lowered his eyes and looked at his hand. There was a bright red jade hairpin in his palm. The jade hairpin was as red as fireworks. It was carved from a whole piece of red jade. Chapter 710. A flame flower was carved on the hairpin, and each petal was vivid and lifelike. Subconsciously, Di Zun hated the color red, but somehow he felt that Ning Xuema was suitable for wearing red. She even said that they should wear red when they got married to show their respect for each other. Therefore, despite his tiredness, he forced himself to find this piece of red jade. He stayed up all night and carefully carved this jade hairpin. He wanted to give it to Xuema when he saw her again. It would be even better if he could put it in her hair personally. The moment he saw her running over, his heart started to beat faster and he was a little flustered. That was the feeling of happiness. It turned out that this was the feeling of waiting for someone and seeing that person running over. He had never experienced this feeling before, but it was strangely beautiful. He was even looking forward to what she would say to him. But he didn't expect that Shuama was most concerned about Yifeng besides thanking him. As soon as she heard about Yifeng's whereabouts, she turned around and ran away without any hesitation. His fingers clenched the jade hairpin tightly. He accidentally used a little too much strength, and the jade hairpin made a few soft sounds. It directly broke into several pieces. His fingers stiffened and he slowly opened his palm. Looking at the broken jade hairpin, he frowned slightly. He didn't use any strength and he didn't even use his psyche power. He just clenched it slightly and it broke into such a state. Ning Shuama knew that Dizun lived on Tianin Peak, so in her impression Tianin Peak was a mountaintop, a peak as tall and steep as Jade Maiden Peak. She only needed to run down the peak, but she didn't expect that she couldn't find the way down the peak even after running along the path she took to come here. There were many paths here, but each path was either leading to those buildings or to the bamboo forest, but none of them led to the foot of the mountain. When she ran to the end of the path, she found that there was a vast body of water at the end. It was more like a water wall than a body of water. Looking out, she felt as if she was looking out from an underwater tunnel, and all she could see were ripples. Was this a wizardry barrier? Or was Tianin Peak really built at the bottom of the sea? If he wanted to leave the peak, he would have to break through the water? Ning Shuama carefully reached out her hand to touch the water wall. She really touched water. The water was real. There was no barrier, but it did not flow over. The water flows downwards and here it becomes a bubble. It seemed that if she wanted to leave the mountain to visit Yifeng, she would have to pass through this water wall. The problem was that she didn't know how far this water wall went. If it was too far or too deep, she might drown before she could even surface. Ning Shuama used to like playing with water, but after being flooded 3 times, she had developed a fear of water. She stood in front of the water wall for a moment. Perhaps this was the only side with a water wall? The other sides might be the way down the mountain. She turned around and began to look for other routes. Another hour passed, and she returned to the front of the wall of water. There were no other roads. Ning Shuama used her superior qigong and circled around the mountain countless times, but she still couldn't find any other passageway. One was the White Tower at the end of the bamboo forest, and below the White Tower was a vast sea of clouds. The other was this water wall of unknown thickness. Which one was the passageway to go down the mountain? When she returned to the end of the bamboo forest, Dizun was no longer there. Chapter 7:11. Ning Shuama also suspected that there was a passage under the sea of clouds, but she couldn't see anything. She threw another stone down, but she didn't hear any sound for a long time. Obviously the valley was very deep. There were ice bees under her feet. If she jumped down she might fall into pieces. She couldn't fly, therefore she could only go back to the water wall. She tried to reach a hand into the water wall. Her whole hand went in. It really felt like entering the water, and it wasn't an illusion. She believed that her whole body could also get into the water wall, and then swim out. The premise was that she wouldn't drown. She shuddered slightly, and the water in the wall of water splashed with her. "I'll take you out." A voice sounded behind her. It was quiet and refreshing like a breeze. Ning Shuama subconsciously turned around and saw the Dizun standing not far from her. This person really came and went like a ghost. He appeared so close to her, and she didn't even notice until he spoke. She simply smiled and said, "Okay, thank you, Dizun." She couldn't help but be polite and alienated when talking to him. The Dizun's eyes slightly deepened. He walked forward and reached out to her. "Give me your hand." His fingers were white and slender, shining faintly under the sunlight. Ning Shuama paused and said, "I'm sorry for being rude." Then she reached out and held his wrist. The Dizun looked down at her hand that was holding his wrist. He asked Shuama to give him her hand, but she held his wrist instead. There seemed to be no difference, but in fact it reflected a person's subtle state of mind. If she completely trusted him, she would obediently let him hold her hand and let him take her out. Only if she subconsciously didn't trust him would she directly hold his hand and take the initiative. It turned out that even if he erased that part of her memory, her trust in him was still very low, and she didn't even realize it herself. His heart was slightly bitter and astringent. Suddenly, he pulled her into his arms. She was shocked and cried out. Her hands and feet reacted before her brain. She let go of his hand and subconsciously hit him with her palm. His eyes flashed slightly, and he did not dodge this palm. This palm imprinted itself on his chest. Bang! With a loud thud, he still stood there steadily, unmoving like a mountain. However, a hint of sadness flashed through his eyes. Are you afraid of me? Ning Xuema only reacted after the slap. Perhaps it was because she was too frightened. She had used all of her strength in that slap. Her palm hurt. If it was an ordinary person, her palm strike would have sent them flying. Fortunately, the other party was a venerable emperor, an omnipotent and super powerful venerable emperor. Then wouldn't this slap of hers be like a tickle to him? Ning Xuema was a little surprised. She herself also felt that her reaction towards the ancestor was somewhat inexplicable, but she just couldn't control herself. She coughed and apologized sincerely. I'm sorry. The ancestor looked at her quietly for a moment, as if he was enduring something. There are two ways to get out of here. The first way is for me to bring you out, but I need to carry you. Secondly, I will teach you the water avoidance technique. However, if you practice this technique, you will need at least 3 days to master it. Which way do you choose? Ning Xuema hovered in her heart for a moment. She was worried about Yifeng. If she didn't go and take a look, she wouldn't be at ease. Therefore, no matter what, she had to go out and take a look first. Oh. Chapter 7:12. I choose the first option. Then I'll have to trouble you, Dizun. Dizun's eyelashes drooped slightly. In such a short period of time, Ning Xuema had thanked him 3 times. What he lacked the most in his life was other people's gratitude and politeness. He had long been used to it. The only thing he wasn't used to was her. He reached out his hand again. Give me your hand. Ning Xuema glanced at him. After all, she had just inexplicably slapped him, so she still felt a little guilty. At this time, she was obedient and put her small hand in his palm. Dizun held her hand and pulled it slightly into his arms. Close your eyes. Ning Xuema remembered that time when she went to Rongyue Tianlan's island because she didn't close her eyes. She decisively closed her eyes. Dizun's palm slightly tightened, and then she only felt a chill around her. She felt the waves of water around her body. She couldn't help but think of the experience of being drowned in the water. Her body stiffened, and with one hand in his palm, she always had the illusion that he would let go in the next moment. She couldn't help but reach out her other hand to grab his robe sleeve. She only felt that it seemed to be safer if she grabbed it. She didn't expect that she wouldn't be able to catch anything. She only grabbed a handful of water. This time she was shocked and couldn't help but open her eyes. In front of her there was a blue wave. There was nothing in the water, only herself. Yes, only herself. She couldn't even see Dizun, who was holding her hand just now. She was thrown into the water again. Was she going to be drowned again? Great fear attacked her, and she couldn't help but rush forward. Xuema! Someone shouted in her ear. She hurriedly looked back, but she couldn't see anyone. No one. No one saved her. She had to save herself. She didn't care and rushed up even more fiercely. However, the water seemed to be very deep. She desperately swam upward. She felt that she had been swimming for 4 or 5 minutes, but there was still a blue and hopeless water above her head. She was extremely scared. Her whole body trembled, and her hands and feet turned cold in an instant. She wanted to swim upstream again, but she didn't expect that her hands and feet seemed to be trapped by water plants, and she couldn't move at all. Despair. An overwhelming sense of despair filled the air. There was a breath stuck in his chest, and he couldn't spit it out. So depressing. So depressing. So depressing. Who was going to save her? Who was going to save her? Was there still no one to save him? Was he still the only one in this world? Her tears could not help but flow out. She felt her head gradually become dizzy and buzzing. She could no longer breathe. Below the heavenly sound peak of the Buddha Lotus Mountain, there was a huge waterfall that cascaded down. Flying straight down 3,000 feet, like the Milky Way falling from the 9th heaven. Using these 2 lines to describe the waterfall was the most appropriate. There was a deep pool below the waterfall, and the water in the pool flowed out of the valley, meandering away. There were 8 disciples of the Sun-Moon sect standing solemnly beside the lake. There were 4 men and 4 women, and they were arranged in a fixed formation. All of them stood as straight as javelins. The sound of water splashing could be heard from the waterfall on the mountain peak. A white shadow passed through the waterfall and floated down. The wide white robe was like a winding cloud, and the jade-colored mask shone faintly under the sunlight. Venerable Sovereign. The 8 disciples bowed in unison. The opportunity for the Venerable Sovereign to leave the mountain was extremely rare. Even the disciples guarding the mountain could not see him more than a few times. There were very few outsiders on the heavenly sound peak, so when the disciples saw the iconic white robe in the wind, they subconsciously knelt down to welcome him. Their hearts were so excited that they were pounding. He would treat those who were truly drowning. He quickly flipped Ning Xuema over so that she was lying on his lap. He pressed his palm against her back and exerted some force. Ning Xuema finally spat out a mouthful of water. She inhaled very little water, so she stopped after spitting out a mouthful. He turned her over again. Xuema was lying weakly in his arms. Her small face was still blue and white. She bit her lips and refused to breathe. The ancestor's eyes darkened. Almost without thinking, he lowered his head and pressed his lips against hers. He forcibly pried open her teeth and gave her a mouthful of air. This was obviously a life-saving move. Ning Xuema's body trembled. Finally, she was able to breathe and choked. The ancestor's hanging heart finally relaxed. He held her in his arms and let her lie on his shoulder. He gently patted her back to help her breathe. It's all right. Don't be afraid. Chapter 7:14. Ning Xuema finally regained her senses. She felt as if she was lying in someone's embrace. There was a faint fragrance lingering around her nose. That fragrance was very familiar. Her body stiffened slightly. She finally regained her senses and opened her eyes abruptly. The first thing she saw was a few men and women dressed in the Sun Moon Sect's uniform. They were standing not far away. Their faces looked as if they had been struck by lightning. And she was lying in the ancestor's embrace, being patted by him like a child. What kind of strange situation was this? Ning Xuema felt as if she had been struck by lightning. She struggled violently and finally broke free from the ancestor's embrace. She looked at the ancestor and then looked around. The ancestor slowly stood up. He was wearing a white jade mask, so Ning Xuema couldn't see his expression clearly. She only felt a pair of extremely dark eyes sizing her up. You were trapped by the water monster in the dreamland. You're fine now. Ning Xuema. She finally remembered everything just now. Her body trembled slightly, but she straightened her back and smiled. I'm sorry, She was an extremely intelligent person. She was also a doctor, so she knew this was a nightmare. Now that she connected the dots, she knew what had happened to her. She clenched her fingers in her sleeves and pursed her thin lips. She had been traumatized by the water. Once one entered the water, it was easy to enter the illusion of drowning. Ning Xuema was in such a situation. Ning Xuema's psychological quality was strong. But after all, her soul had been abused. The scene of being drowned in water and unable to survive had been engraved in her bones. She couldn't forget it for a while. Let's go. The ancestor raised his sleeve and held her cold little hand. I'll send you to the Celestial Lake Pavilion. He took Xuema and left, leaving behind the Sun Moon Sect's disciples who were almost petrified. They looked at each other in dismay. This was the ancestor? The venerable sovereign that even gods and ghosts couldn't approach. Could it be an imposter? Who was that girl? To actually be treated like this by an emperor. Heavens! Even if the sun rose from the west, they might not be so shocked. In front of him was another boundless body of water. In the middle of the body of water was an antique waterside pavilion. A narrow coral-paved path led to the waterside pavilion. Ning Xuema knew that this was Celestial Lake, and Yifeng should be in the pavilion. She realized that she seemed to be afraid of water now. The sight of this large body of water made her scalp tingle. She stood by the lake and calmed herself down before taking a deep breath. Dizun stood beside her and saw that she was not in a hurry to walk on the coral path. Instead, she stood in the same place. Her pretty face was faintly pale, and even her hand that was holding his was cold. Scared, he asked in a low voice, Seeing her like this made the ancestor's heart feel like it was being twisted. Don't be scared. I'll send you there. Dizun simply held her hand and walked towards the path. It was a path that was not only in name but also in reality. The entire path was less than a foot wide, and on both sides of the path were rippling waves of the lake. From afar, this path looked more like a red snake winding in the water. In the past, Ning Shuama naturally didn't care about walking on such a path. Chapter 7:15. In the past, Ning Shuama wouldn't have cared about walking on such a small path. Even if it was half as narrow, she would still be able to walk steadily without fear. But now, she found out that she was actually afraid of water. Ning Shuama had never been afraid of anything, but now she was afraid of water. She was afraid from the bottom of her heart. When the ancestor pulled her towards the small path, her legs began to tremble. Unforgivable. Not to mention others, even she herself felt that such a cowardly person was unforgivable. Shuama was irritated. She threw off the ancestor's hand. No, I'll do it myself. She had to overcome this. She had to become stronger. She had to create her own world on this continent. How could she be afraid of water? She took another deep breath, controlled her trembling legs, and walked towards the coral path. Dizun stood in the same place, looking at her straight figure. A trace of sadness flashed through his eyes. He looked down at his hand. His palm still had the warmth of her small hand. But when Shuama threw him off, she didn't hesitate. Trust. What Shuama lacked the most was trust. When Shuama was with him, even when he held her hand, he could feel her stiffness and her defense. Moreover, this stiffness and defense was involuntary. It wasn't intentional. It was obvious that it came from the bottom of her heart. It seemed that although her memories had been erased, her soul still hated him, resented him, and despaired of him. So even if she lost her memories, Shuama's soul still subconsciously remembered this feeling. That was why she was so repulsed by his approach. The ancestor raised his hand and rubbed his forehead. To be honest, he didn't know what to do. This was the first time he felt that things were a bit tricky. This was the first time he had come into contact with such feelings. He was inevitably at a loss. Thinking about it, he remembered the great love Saint Rongyue Tianlan. After Rongyue Tianlan returned to his own carefree island, he fell into a deep sleep. Healing Ning Shuama's soul consumed too much of his willpower. He felt that his bones were sore and his legs were numb. He needed a good rest to recover. While he was having a good dream, the sound transmission amulet on his body vibrated continuously, waking him up from his dream. He groggily touched the sound transmission amulet and took a look. Half of his drowsiness had disappeared. It was the ancestor's sound transmission. Rongyu Tianlan subconsciously looked at the sky outside. The sun had only risen a pole high. Heavens, wasn't Dizun the most tired one last night? Shouldn't he be meditating in seclusion? Why did she contact him so early in the morning? Did something happen to Ning Shuama? He picked up the voice transmission talisman. Emperor's throne? Why would you call me if you need anything? But Miss Ning. The ancestor's cold voice came from the sound transmitting charm. She's fine. Rongyue Tianlan heaved a sigh of relief. It was good that the little girl was fine. His guilt could finally come to an end. He yawned and asked, Dizwa, why are you contacting me now? There was a moment of silence on the other side, as if he didn't know what to say. It's rare for an ancestor to be so speechless. Rongyue Tianlan's interest was immediately piqued. Emperor's throne? She's afraid of water. She's afraid of me. The ancestor's voice was calm. Rongyue Tianlan. The ancestor had woken him up so early in the morning just for this. Rongyue Tianlan lay down again, his voice weak. Emperor's throne. Her soul has just been tormented. If I'm not wrong, she should have been drowned. It's very normal for her to be afraid of water. Chapter 7:16. It's Ning Shuama. If she were an ordinary girl, she would have gone crazy after experiencing these things. As for you, Dizwa, I'm afraid her soul has remembered the feeling of despair she felt for you. Therefore, she subconsciously doesn't want to rely on you anymore. Her trust in you has decreased. Ronglan Tianlan was indeed a Casanova. He analyzed the girl's psychology clearly and logically. It was rare for the ancestor to listen to him so much, but he didn't say anything. This made Rongyue Tianlan suspect that the ancestor was distracted. Dizwa, are you listening? Of course, the ancestor replied. After a pause he added, get to the point. Rongyue Tianlan wanted to cry. He endured his sleepiness and said so much. How was it not the point? If someone else said that to him, he would have turned off the sound-transmitting charm and refused to listen. But the ancestor, alas, forget it. He didn't want to argue with the ancestor. What's the point that you want to hear? What should I do? The ancestor's question sounded like an order. Rongyue Tianlan immediately became excited. The ancestor was asking him for advice on how to pick up girls? Then he had found the right person. He took the fan that never left his side and began to talk with assurance. The ancestor listened to Rongyue Tianlan's unique skill of picking up girls while paying attention to Ning Shuama. She walked very slowly on the coral path. Although her back was straight, he could see that her legs were still shaking. She should be very scared, but she was also trying to overcome this fear. This girl had always been strong. Although she looked delicate and weak, she had always been conquering others. Of course, she was also conquering herself. There was a splash of water nearby. A big head popped out of the water and shouted happily at Ning Shuama master. It was Kiran. After Ning Shuama's soul entered her body, it was put down on the Tianyin Peak. The ancestor said that its martial arts were too weak, and it needed intensive practice. He directly drove it into the big lake. It had been worried about Ning Shuama. Now that it suddenly saw her, it was happy and immediately shouted. Kiran's appearance was too sudden, and Ning Shuama was in a state of high tension. The coral path was narrow, and he was startled by its sudden movement. His body swayed and he fell into the water with a splash. The ancestor was startled for a moment. He was about to rush over and pull her out when Kiran moved quickly and used his body to push her up. It was still puzzled. When did its master become so easily frightened? Ning Shuama leaned on Kiran's back and couldn't help but grip its horn so tightly that her fingers turned white. Kiran could feel her trembling and was even more surprised. Master, what's wrong? Ning Shuama's face turned pale. She knew that she shouldn't be afraid, but she couldn't stop herself from trembling. She wanted to reply, I'm fine, but her teeth were chattering. How could she say that? Master? Master! Kiran panicked and hurriedly turned to look at her. A white shadow flashed in front of her. The ancestor directly stepped on the water and came over. He stretched out his hand to Ning Shuama. Don't be afraid. Come to me. Ning Shuama leaned on Kiran's back and didn't raise her head. Her wet hair hung down, making it difficult for people to see her face. No, she finally spat out 2 words. Let me be alone. She had to overcome herself. She had to. The ancestor's sleeves stiffened in the air for a long time and slowly drooped down. He said in a low voice, okay? Remember, I'm by your side. I won't let you get hurt again. It was the first time he had said so much. However, Ning Shuama didn't respond at all. She acted as if she didn't hear him. The ancestor slightly lowered his eyes and had to return to the coral path by himself. Chapter 7:17. Kiran didn't know what had happened. It looked around blankly. Who could tell it what had happened? Why did its master become like this? It could feel that its master was afraid of water, so it tried to comfort her. Master, don't be afraid. The water is very good. It's very comfortable to stay in it. Master, you used to be able to swim and you can swim very well. She knew. She knew. She knew all of this. She understood. However, she couldn't control the fear of water that came from the depths of her soul. This fear made her angry with herself, disappointed with herself. Her hands and feet were trembling, especially her feet that were still in the water. They seemed to be cramping, and even the tips of her feet were stiff. She leaned on Kiran's back and didn't get up for a long time. Dizun stood there and looked at her trembling body. He saw her shoulders trembling slightly, and his heart felt as if it was drowning. Was she crying? This girl who was always smiling and unyielding at all times was crying? Just because she couldn't overcome her fear of water? Dizun clenched his fists so tightly that his fingertips turned white. If he hadn't delayed that life-saving 4 hours, Things wouldn't have turned out like this. This was the first time he had encountered such a situation. He didn't know how to deal with it. How could he break the knot in her heart? Miss Ning. A calm voice sounded from the waterside pavilion. Yifeng walked out. Ning Xuema's body stiffened slightly. She naturally recognized Yifeng's voice. She took a deep breath and slowly raised her body. Her fingers brushed her wet hair. There were still traces of water on her face. It was unknown whether it was the water droplets that fell into the water or the tears that she had just cried. While brushing her hair, she wiped her eyes and looked at Yifeng. She was stunned for a moment. Yifeng had regained his human appearance. He was wearing black clothes and had black hair. His facial features were well defined, and he was handsome and neat. Although he was a man of few words, he was very observant. He had seen Ning Xuemo repeatedly drowned by Yi Qingguan. He knew her not, so he could understand her current behavior. Just now, he was meditating to recover. When he heard movement and opened his eyes to look outside, Ning Xuema had already walked onto the coral path. Yifeng had already seen that she was afraid, but he could not go out at that time. No one was willing to let their friend see them at their most embarrassing moment, especially those who were strong-willed. He wanted to wait for Ning Xuema to walk over with a strong will. Then he could talk to her as if nothing had happened and say goodbye to her. He did not expect her to fall into the water. The moment she fell into the water, he almost rushed out. Fortunately, Kiran was smart enough to save her immediately. Chapter 7:18. Because he was wearing a mask, no one could see his face clearly. However, Yifeng felt a sense of loneliness and desolation from him. Yifeng briefly explained how he was rescued. Ning Xuema was happy for him. Now that he had returned to his human form, wouldn't he have a chance with Yan Ziyun again? One of them stood on the coral road, while the other sat on the back of the Qilin. They chatted for a while. Perhaps it was because the conversation was relaxing, or perhaps it was because the conversation diverted her attention. Ning Xuema was finally not so nervous. Her feet no longer trembled in the water, and she slowly relaxed. However, she still subconsciously held the Qilin horn, not daring to loosen it. Yifeng saw the changes in her. He pondered for a while and asked tentatively, "Miss Ning, I have also just turned into a human. I want to try the taste of swimming in the water again. I wonder if I can accompany you? Can we teach each other?" He seemed to be asking Ning Xuema, but his eyes couldn't help but look at the ancestor. He always felt that the white-clothed god treated Ning Xuema a little differently. It was as if he had fallen in love with Miss Ning. Men who fell in love were possessive. They probably wouldn't allow other men to play in the water with the woman they liked. Of course, he didn't want to play in the water. He just wanted to take care of her and solve the knot in her heart. The ancestor didn't speak. He was still silent, standing there like a background. Ning Xuema's eyes lit up. She knew Yifeng's swimming ability very well. She also knew that he was a very reliable person. Moreover, Xuema had shared joys and sorrows with him in the water. She had been running for her life in the water for such a long time. Yet Yifeng had taken care of her extremely well. Even in such a dangerous situation, he did not let her drown even a little bit. Swimming with such a person, she wouldn't drown again. She really wanted to get rid of her fear of water, so she didn't care about anything else. When Yifeng said this, she immediately nodded and blurted out, "Okay." Yifeng looked at Dizun again. Dizun nodded slightly and said, "Don't drown her." She turned around and fluttered away from the coral path, walking into the distance. His voice was very calm, and he didn't hesitate to turn around and leave. It was as if he didn't care about Yifeng and Ning Xuema traveling together. Looking at his back, Yifeng had a complicated look in his eyes. He didn't know about the grievances between Ning Xuema and the ancestor, but he remembered the last 2 hours when he and Ning Xuema were on the run. At that time, her eyes lit up and she told him that strong reinforcements were coming. They were about to be saved. As long as he persevered a little longer, he would be out of danger. It was because of this belief that they persevered for more than 4 hours. He clearly remembered that when the white cat in his arms started to say these words, its spirit was excited, its eyes were shining, and its little mouth was even curled up. He could clearly see that the cat in his arms was full of joy later. When the reinforcements didn't come for a long time, the white cat in his arms began to feel uneasy. But she still comforted him over and over again, or encouraged herself. She said over and over again that he would come, and that he would be here soon. Perhaps he had already arrived nearby. The Ning Shuama he knew looked cunning and lively, but she was extremely steady and calm. At that time it was the first time he saw her like this. He clearly sensed that she was full of hope, then uneasiness, and then despair when she was caught. At that time, Yifeng didn't know who Shuama's reinforcements were. It wasn't until they were really rescued that he knew it was Di Zun. Chapter 719. However, the ancestor still arrived and saved them. According to reason, Ning Shuama should be very grateful to this supreme divinity. However, Ning Shuama's attitude towards the ancestor was a bit strange. Maybe she was Han Shanyue's concubine so she couldn't get close to the ancestor? Or maybe he misunderstood the ancestor. Was the ancestor's concern for Ning Shuama just an elder's junior? The ancestor's matter wasn't something Yifeng could interfere with, so these thoughts just flashed in his mind before he put them aside. He was also a straightforward person, so he directly jumped into the water. He came to Ning Shuama's side and said, "Shall we start?" Perhaps subconsciously, Ning Shuama knew that Yifeng was a strong backing in the water, so she wouldn't drown no matter what, so she was less afraid of water. She tried to go into the water. Not far from the celestial lake, there was a mountain rock with a bamboo forest behind it. The ancestor was sitting in the bamboo forest at this moment. The wind rustled through the trees. The ancestor was sitting on a praying mat with a chess table in front of him. He was playing chess with himself. He looked relaxed and calm, as if he was really immersed in the game. However, people who often watched him play chess could see that he was not playing at his usual level. It was as if he was playing casually from his position. He could easily hear all the movements in the celestial lake. He heard Shuama carefully go into the water, heard her movements were stiff when she paddled, and heard Yifeng comforting and encouraging her in a low voice. He heard her voice slowly relax from trembling. He heard her interaction with Yifeng and Kiran. He heard that she was no longer nervous when she swam in the water, and she was already following her heart. The sound-transmitting talisman at his waist suddenly lit up. He picked it up, and Rongyue Tianlan's voice came from the talisman. He seemed to have just woken up and was in a good mood. He said, "Dizwa, I suddenly thought of a treatment for hydrophobia. Tell me about it." The ancestor's words were always simple and clear. Dizwa, the reason why she is afraid of water is because she has been severely submerged in water. She lacks a sense of security in water. If there was someone who could give her a strong sense of security by her side to protect her, it would be best if they could play in the water at the same time. Perhaps she could slowly untie the knot in her heart. "Dizwa, your swimming skills are not bad. How about?" "She doesn't believe me." Di Zun only said 4 words before he cut off his jubilant speech. Rongyue Tianlan. Emperor's throne. The ancestor didn't speak again, but he didn't close the sound-transmitting talisman. Rongyue Tianlan could only hear his shallow breathing. A moment later, the ancestor's low voice came from the sound-transmitting charm. "Rongyu, what should I do?" Rongyue Tianlan's hands trembled slightly. They had known each other for so many years, but this was the first time he had heard the ancestor speak like this. His voice was still flat, but it was clearly transmitted to Rongyue Tianlan's ears. "She doesn't believe me. Rongyu, what should I do?" Rongyue Tianlan was silent for a while, and his voice became serious. "Dizwa, have you not rested at all?" The ancestor didn't say anything. Rongyue Tianlan's voice was somewhat anxious and angry. "Dizwa, Rongyue feels that the most important thing for you now is to go into seclusion. At least for half a month." He hadn't rested for a few days and nights. He had continuously used forbidden techniques to search for people. He had continuously healed that lady's body and soul. He had continuously looked for medicine. He hadn't rested for a moment. Did he really think that he was made of iron? Even if he was made of iron, he wouldn't be able to stand this. Chapter 720. Time passed by slowly. 2 hours passed by, and then another 2 hours passed by. The sun had risen from the east to the middle of the sky. It was already noon. Ning Shuama's mental fortitude was strong after all. She, Yifeng, and Kiran floated in the water for half a day. Finally, she wasn't that afraid anymore. Gradually, she dared to go into the water by herself. She swam in the water alone. When she raised her head, she saw two young girls standing on the shore with trays in their hands. They smiled at her and Yifeng. "Miss Ning, you must be tired from swimming too, right? Come up and eat something to replenish your strength." Ning Shuama was indeed hungry after swimming for half a day. She swam to the shore. Kiran saw the food and cheered. So many delicious dishes. Crystal pork trotters, stir-fried blue and white flowers. It called out a long list of dishes in one breath. Then it happily added, "Master, these are all your favorite dishes." Ning Shuama looked at the delicious dishes and was slightly stunned. Kiran was right. These dishes were all her favorite dishes. In the Sun Moon sect, there was only one person who could possibly understand her tastes. She naturally saw the ancestor leave just now. She didn't know why, but even if he didn't say or do anything, she was still nervous and even a little embarrassed. If there was one person she didn't want to let see her most embarrassing side, that person would be the ancestor. Therefore, when he turned around and left just now, she was quite happy. She could finally relax. Shuama was playing with Yifeng and Kiran in the water just now. Because she was so focused, she had forgotten about the ancestor. Now that she finally remembered, she was happy to see these exquisite dishes. However, she still felt a little guilty. She casually asked, "Did the ancestor ask you to send these over? Where is he?" The two women smiled sweetly and didn't answer Ning Shuama's question. They only said, "Miss Ning, try it. Does it suit your taste?" The food was naturally to Ning Shuama's taste, and even more to Kiran's taste. After the two of them and Kiran finished their meal, Ning Shuama thanked the two maids who delivered the food. The two maids smiled and walked away. In order to train herself, Ning Shuama jumped into the water again not long after the meal. Yifeng naturally followed. Kiran was a person who loved to see the world plunged into chaos. Naturally, she was also playing around in the water. When it saw that Ning Shuama's movements were somewhat restrained while she swam in the water, it suddenly decided to play a prank on her. It dove into the water and suddenly rushed up from the water. Ning Shuama, who was swimming on the water's surface, was flipped over and directly plunged into the water. Although Ning Shuama was no longer afraid of water, she still didn't dare to dive underwater for the time being. When she suddenly dove into the water, the familiar feeling made her panic. The water pressed down on her from all directions, causing her to immediately panic. She could not help but struggle a few times. Fortunately, Yifeng was not far from her and had been paying attention to her. Once he saw that things were not going well, he immediately made a beautiful leap and rushed to Ning Shuama's side, pulling her out. Because of the timely rescue, Ning Shuama didn't choke on water this time. However, she was really scared and her face was pale again. Yifeng held her arm and said, "It's okay. Don't be afraid." Ning Shuama took a deep breath and suppressed her beating heart. She smiled and said, "Yifeng, thank you." When Yifeng saw that she had recovered, he immediately let go of her arm and said, "Are you okay? Why don't you go ashore and take a rest?" Oh. Chapter 721. Ning Shuama shook her head. "No need. I'm fine." She had already overcome a large part of her fear. She couldn't let all her previous efforts go to waste. Diving used to be her strong point. She had to overcome her fear before she could practice again. Yifeng didn't say anything else. He only said, "Okay, I want to practice again." As he spoke, he looked at the shore again. When he brought Ning Shuama out of the water, he vaguely saw a white shadow flash by the shore. However, by the time he finished pacifying Ning Shuama, the white shadow had disappeared without a trace. He didn't know if his eyes were playing tricks on him. The sun was setting in the west, and the sky was filled with red clouds. In the bamboo forest, Dizun was still sitting there. The chessboard in front of him was still the same layout. He lowered his eyes slightly. There was a clay stove beside him. The charcoal fire in the stove was blazing, and a pot of water was boiling on the stove. There was a teapot and teacups on the small table next to him. The tea in the teacup was already cold, but he didn't take a sip. He sat there cross-legged with a book on his lap. He also didn't turn a page for a long time. He knew that with Yifeng's help, she had finally overcome her fear of water and even dared to dive again. When she emerged from the water after diving for a few minutes, he even heard her laughter as if she had been relieved of a heavy burden. It was very clear, very proud, and very gratifying. He knew that Shuama had finally walked out of that psychological shadow. When he heard that she had finally come ashore, he hesitated for a moment when he saw the maid waiting by the shore. The maid was sent by him earlier. She brought a cloth curtain and the clothes that she should change into. He heard Shuama talking to Yifeng while she was tidying her long hair after changing her clothes. Yifeng also changed into a set of clean clothes. He was carrying a bag on his back. He said goodbye. Ning Shuama also knew that since Yifeng had returned to his human body, he would definitely return to Yen Ziyuan's side. Ning Shuama naturally couldn't say anything about this kind of thing. She only hoped that Yifeng could obtain his own happiness. Yifeng did not say anything. He had always been introverted and would never confide in anyone about his plans. Right now, all he cared about was Yiyu's happiness. Only when she was happy could he truly let go. He had planned to say goodbye to Ning Shuama in the morning and leave, but he didn't expect that Ning Shuama was so afraid of water, so he stayed for another day without hesitation to accompany her out of her psychological trauma. Now that he saw that she had basically recovered, he was relieved. Naturally, he could leave without worry. He had his own obsession, his own protection. Yifeng's journey was very smooth, perhaps due to the ancestors' arrangements. The Sun Moon sect's disciples led him out of Buddha Lotus Mountain and onto his own journey. Ning Shuama also directly sent him to the foot of the mountain. Seeing Yifeng's figure faintly disappearing under the setting sun, she felt slightly disappointed. On the way, Yifeng had asked Shuama what her plans were for the future. She only replied with 2 words, "Become stronger." Only by becoming stronger could she take revenge. Only then could she stand on her own 2 feet. Only then could she not be bullied. Han Shanhua said that she had the fate of being a jinx and seemed to be destined to lead an army. In other words, she also had the physique of Tang Sung, which was very easy to attract disaster. With such a physique, how could she not become stronger? Yifeng gave a rare smile and said that with her current conditions, becoming stronger was very easy. He advised her to seize the opportunity. Ning Shuama was also smart. She naturally understood what Yifeng meant by opportunity. The ancestor. But was this person really someone she could grasp? Chapter 722. What did the ancestor think of her? Or rather, what did he think she was? He didn't say, and she couldn't decide whether to ask or not. Perhaps she should have a good talk with the ancestor? The Sun Moon sect disciple leading the way was a handsome youth. He was as gentle as water, and had an aura about him that made people want to get close to him like a spring breeze. In Ning Shuama's heart, Buddha Lotus Mountain was the location of the world's #1 sect. So it must be heavily guarded and filled with traps. However, she didn't expect this place to be so beautiful. Not only was there beautiful scenery everywhere, there weren't any traps or patrolling guards along the way. Occasionally, she would see groups of disciples walking by, chatting and laughing. When they saw the disciple leading the way, they would stop and greet him. They would respectfully call him Martial Uncle Jing, and Ning Shuama's heart stirred. In the small database she had inquired about earlier, the ancestor did indeed have a direct disciple named Yelu Jing'an, who was in charge of the Sun Moon sect's affairs. He could be considered a person who was second only to the ancestor. If Yi Qinghuan hadn't been expelled from the sect, she would have to call him senior martial brother. It was rumored that this person was very talented. Not only was he a genius in psychokinesis, he was also very good at planning. After becoming the ancestor's disciple, he cultivated to Earth grade 7 in less than 10 years, shocking the world. He was highly regarded by the ancestor, and was appointed as an elder of the Sun Moon sect at a young age. He was in charge of the Sun Moon sect's affairs. These years he had managed the Sun Moon sect well. On this continent, it could be said that he was a person who could make the earth tremble with a stomp of his foot. Ning Shuama didn't expect that the gentle youth leading the way would be him, and was momentarily surprised. At the same time her heart stirred. The Sun Moon sect's rules were actually very strict. A person of Yelujing and status definitely wouldn't be in charge of leading the way. Now that he was personally leading the way for her, someone must have ordered him to do so. And this person could be said to be at her beck and call other than the ancestor. Who else could order this person, who could be considered a sect leader, to lower himself to lead the way for her? She couldn't help but look at this Yelujing and a few more times. This person looked extremely young, about 20 years old. She also observed the disciples passing by a few times. Handsome men and beautiful women. The men and women he met on Buddha Lotus Mountain were each more pleasing to the eye than the last. The women were of different shapes and sizes, each with their own unique characteristics. The men were all suave, elegant, cold and cheerful. Ningxuama couldn't take it all in. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. No wonder the people of the pugilistic world all said that the Sun Moon sect was a place where the best of the best gathered. Looking at it now, it really lived up to its reputation. Even the gardeners who were trimming the flowers and trees among the flowers and trees were handsome and imposing. The ancestor was truly blessed. She could see so many handsome men and beautiful women every day. No wonder he was so aloof and looked down on all the women in the world. With so many handsome men and beautiful women around him, he was probably tired of looking at them, right? Then Ningxuama understood that he treated her differently. But why was he acting this way? She slowly recalled all the times she had met him. It was as if all the times she had met him were not pleasant. She lowered her eyes slightly, her thoughts drifting away like catkins. She carefully analyzed everything that had happened between her and the ancestor. From Yifeng's words, she was even more certain that the ancestor had helped her escape danger from Yiqinguan. You're tuning into the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.